Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you're listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. When I was 17, I had my first encounter with what people call sleep paralysis. It started innocently enough, just me lying in bed after a long day at school. I had been scrolling through my phone until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. I fell asleep without even realizing it. I remember dreaming of nothing in particular, just a haze of shapes and colors. Then, suddenly, I woke up. Or at least, I thought I woke up. My room was dark except for the faint orange glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. At first, I felt disoriented, like I couldn't remember where I was. I tried to shift to my side, but my body wouldn't move. I told myself it was just my muscles being lazy from sleeping too long. But the more I tried, the more I realized something was wrong. I couldn't wiggle my fingers, lift my arms, or even turn my head. My chest felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I wanted to call out for my mom, but when I opened my mouth, no sound came out. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. You know that feeling you get when someone's standing behind you, and you just know they're there? It was like that, except this time, I couldn't turn around to check. My eyes darted around the room, looking for anything out of place. At first, everything seemed normal. The desk was piled with books. My chair had the sweater I'd thrown over it earlier. But then, I saw it. In the corner of my room, where the shadows pooled thickest, something moved. It wasn't like a normal shadow cast by the furniture or the light outside. This shadow was darker, deeper, like it absorbed the light around it. It shifted, almost like it was alive, and then it began to take shape. Slowly, it rose up, stretching taller and taller until it nearly reached the ceiling. My breath hitched as I saw what looked like a head forming at the top. No features, no eyes, just an outline of a face, smooth and blank like polished stone. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The shadow seemed to notice me, though it didn't have eyes to see with. I could feel it focusing on me, like its presence was wrapping around my chest, squeezing tighter and tighter. It started to move closer, gliding across the floor without making a sound. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat like a hammer against my ribs. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just a trick of my half-awake brain. But the closer it got, the harder it was to believe that. The shadow stopped at the foot of my bed. It loomed over me, its head tilted slightly to the side as if it were curious. My whole body felt frozen, trapped under its invisible weight. The air around me grew colder, so cold that I could see my breath forming little clouds in the dim light. The shadow didn't move for what felt like hours. It just stood there, watching me, or maybe studying me. Then, without warning, it leaned forward. It didn't make a sound, but I swear I could feel something whispering in my ear. The words weren't in any language I knew, but they wormed their way into my mind, sharp and intrusive. It felt like the shadow was trying to communicate something, but all it did was fill me with an overwhelming sense of dread. My chest burned as I struggled to take a breath. The weight pressed harder, pinning me down. I thought I was going to suffocate, and then, just as quickly as it appeared, the shadow began to fade. It didn't retreat or shrink back into the corner. It simply dissolved into the darkness, leaving the room eerily quiet. I gasped for air, my body jerking upright as if I'd just broken through the surface of deep water. My room looked exactly the same as it had before. Nothing was out of place, and there was no sign of the shadow. But the feeling of its presence lingered, like a cold hand resting on my shoulder. That night, I didn't go back to sleep. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. The memory of its whispers played on a loop in my mind, like an echo I couldn't escape. I stayed up until the sun rose, the first rays of light washing away the suffocating darkness in my room. I thought that maybe, with the morning, the fear would fade too. But it didn't. The following nights were worse. Even though I kept the lamp on, I could feel it watching me from the corners of the room. It never fully appeared again, but its presence was always there, just on the edge of my vision. I could feel its eyes, or whatever it used to see, following me as I moved around the room. I started sleeping with my back against the wall, thinking that would make me feel safer. It didn't. One night, about a week after the first encounter, I woke up to the same heavy feeling on my chest. This time, I didn't even bother trying to move. I knew I wouldn't be able to. The room was darker than usual, the streetlight outside flickering faintly. I didn't have to look to know it was there. The air was thick with its presence, colder than ever before. I felt the mattress sink slightly at the foot of my bed, as if someone, or something, was climbing onto it. My heart raced, my breath shallow and uneven. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it moving closer, the weight shifting as it crawled toward me. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that if I couldn't see it, it couldn't see me. But I was wrong. The whispering started again, low and guttural, like the voice of a dozen people speaking at once. This time, it was louder, more insistent, and I could feel its breath against my face, icy and sharp. It didn't stop until I forced myself to open my eyes. When I did, it was gone. The weight lifted, the whispers stopped, and the room was silent once more. I told my parents about it the next day, hoping they'd have some explanation. They brushed it off, saying it was just a bad dream, a side effect of stress, or maybe sleeping on my back. But I knew it was more than that. I started researching sleep paralysis and shadow figures, desperate for answers. What I found didn't make me feel any better. Stories like mine were everywhere, and no one had a real explanation. Some people thought it was a trick of the mind, while others believed it was something more, a dark presence that fed on fear. Even now, years later, I still think about those nights. I've had sleep paralysis a few times since then, but the shadow hasn't come back. At least, not in the same way. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed and the room is quiet, I feel that same cold weight on my chest, just for a moment. And every time, I wonder if it's watching, waiting for the right time to return. It was supposed to be an ordinary night. I had stayed up late finishing a history paper, my desk lamp the only source of light in my small bedroom. By the time I finally crawled into bed, my body was heavy with exhaustion. I didn't even bother pulling the covers up fully before I drifted off to sleep. I don't remember dreaming that night. What I do remember is waking up in the dark. At first, I thought it was just my body reacting to the sudden quiet after hours of typing and thinking. But then I tried to turn over, and I couldn't. My body felt like it was encased in cement, every muscle locked in place. The room around me was as still as death. My desk lamp was off, but the faint moonlight outside lit up part of the room, just enough to make out the shapes of my furniture. I tried to tell myself it was just a bad dream, that any moment I'd fully wake up and shake it off. But the longer I lay there, unable to move, the more I realized this was real. Then I felt it. The air in the room shifted, like something heavy had entered and sucked all the warmth away. It wasn't cold exactly, but the kind of chill that sinks into your bones when you're being watched. My heart started to pound, but my body stayed frozen. I wanted to scream, to call out for my dad in the next room, but no sound would come out. I glanced toward the door, hoping to see it still closed and safe. That's when I noticed the shadow. It started small, just a darker patch in the corner of the room, where the light didn't quite reach. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the moonlight, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, the shadow stretched and grew, rising from the floor like smoke. My eyes widened in terror as it began to take shape, a figure, tall and impossibly thin. Its head tilted slightly to one side as if it was studying me. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real. Maybe my tired brain was making things up. Maybe I was still dreaming. But the way it moved, the slow, jerking motions of its limbs as it stepped closer, was too real to ignore. The shadow stopped at the foot of my bed, looming over me. It didn't have a face, but I could feel it staring, its gaze heavy and suffocating. My chest burned as I struggled to breathe, the weight of its presence pressing down on me. I tried to close my eyes, to block it out, but my eyelids wouldn't obey. All I could do was watch as the shadow leaned closer. I wanted to scream. I wanted to thrash and kick and do anything to make it go away. But I couldn't. The shadow's form flickered, like it wasn't fully solid. and then it reached out. Its hand, or what I thought was a hand, hovered inches above my chest. The air around it grew colder, and I felt a pressure, like it was trying to reach inside me. For a moment, everything went silent. The world around me seemed to stop. Then, I heard it, a faint whisper, low and guttural, like it was coming from deep within the shadow itself. I couldn't understand the words, but they filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. The shadow leaned closer, its form almost blending with the darkness around me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear. My vision blurred, and for a second, I thought I was going to pass out. And then, just like that, it was gone. The weight lifted from my chest, and I could move again. I sat up so fast I nearly fell out of bed, gasping for air like I had just been drowning. My heart was racing, my hands trembling as I reached for the lamp on my bedside table. When the light flicked on, the room looked exactly the same as it always had. The desk was still cluttered with papers, my backpack slouched against the wall. But the air felt different, thicker, heavier, like the shadow had left something behind. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every creak of the house, every shift of the shadows outside, made my heart leap into my throat. I kept the lamp on until morning, my eyes darting to the corner where the shadow had appeared, half expecting it to come back. The next day, I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a product of stress and exhaustion, but deep down, I knew better. Something had been in my room that night, something that wasn't supposed to be there. The following nights were no better. Even though I left the lamp on and tried sleeping with the TV on for background noise, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I started waking up in the middle of the night, unable to move, the same heavy presence pressing down on me. Sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of the shadow in the corner, just watching. It never spoke again, but its silence was almost worse. The way it lingered, like it was waiting for something, made my skin crawl. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I moved to the couch in the living room, hoping that being closer to my family would make me feel safer. But the shadow followed me there. I woke up to the same paralyzing fear, the same figure standing in the corner, its head tilted in that unnatural way. I started avoiding sleep altogether, staying up as late as I could until exhaustion finally won. Even then, the shadow found me. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, it was always there, lurking just out of reach. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. My parents noticed the bags under my eyes, the way I jumped at every little sound, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them. What would I even say? That I was being haunted by a shadow? They think I was crazy. The shadow hasn't appeared in a while now, but I still can't sleep with the lights off. Every night, as I lay in bed, I can't help but glance at the corners of the room, half expecting to see it standing there. And sometimes, just for a split second, I think I do. It began on an ordinary night, one of those uneventful evenings where nothing remarkable happens. I had finished my homework, scrolled through my phone, and climbed into bed at my usual time. My room was quiet, the kind of silence that feels comforting. I left the curtains slightly open, letting in a faint glow from the streetlight outside. I fell asleep quickly, not thinking for a second that the night would turn into something I'd never forget. I woke up suddenly, my eyes snapping open as if someone had called my name. The room was darker than usual. The streetlight outside, which usually bathed the walls in a warm yellow hue, was flickering, leaving the room in intermittent shadows. At first, I thought it was just a dream that startled me awake, but something felt wrong. My chest felt heavy, and my limbs refused to move. Panic bubbled up as I realized I couldn't turn my head or even lift a finger. I was trapped, wide awake, in my own body. My breathing was shallow, the weight on my chest growing heavier by the second. I told myself it was sleep paralysis. I had read about it before, how your mind wakes up before your body does. But knowing that didn't make it any less terrifying. Then I felt it, a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. The temperature dropped, and the warm cocoon of my blankets suddenly felt like thin paper against the cold. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my overactive imagination fueled by fear. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. At first, It looked like a darker patch of shadow near my closet. It didn't move, but it didn't belong there. My heart raced as I strained my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the flickering streetlight. But the shadow didn't waver or fade. It grew. Slowly, it rose from the floor, stretching higher and higher until it nearly touched the ceiling. My breath caught in my throat as the shape began to solidify. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its form was tall and thin, impossibly thin, with arms that hung too long at its sides. Its head was featureless, smooth like a mannequin's, but I could feel it looking at me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was frozen. I wanted to close my eyes, but my body refused to obey. All I could do was watch as the figure moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. The shadow stopped at the foot of my bed, standing unnaturally still. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own frantic heartbeat. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the presence of this thing was sucking all the oxygen out of the room. I tried to focus on anything else, on the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen or the ticking of the clock on my wall. But it was impossible to ignore the figure looming over me. It began to move again, this time bending forward, its featureless head tilting as if to study me more closely. Then came the whispering. It wasn't like any sound I had ever heard before. Low and guttural, like a dozen voices speaking at once, their words overlapping and indistinct. The sound didn't come from the shadow itself, but seemed to echo inside my head, bouncing around my skull and growing louder with each passing second. I wanted to cover my ears, to block out the noise, but I couldn't move. The whispers grew sharper, more urgent, like they were trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. I could feel tears streaming down my face, hot against my cold skin, as the figure leaned closer. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. My chest felt like it was being crushed, my breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the shadow recoiled, snapping upright like it had been startled. For a brief moment, the whispers stopped, and the room was eerily quiet. Then, without warning, the figure began to dissolve. Its edges blurred, the solid blackness fading into wisps of smoke that melted into the surrounding darkness. The weight lifted from my chest, and I gasped for air, my body jerking as if I had been released from invisible chains. I sat up, my whole body trembling as I fumbled for the lamp on my bedside table. When the light flooded the room, everything looked normal. The closet door was shut, the chair in the corner held my pile of clothes, and the shadows were just shadows again. But the air still felt wrong, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the shadow, hear the whispers. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a figment of my imagination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The next morning, I told my mom about it. She listened patiently, her brow furrowing as I described the shadow and the whispers. When I finished, she gave me a small, reassuring smile and said, "It was just a bad dream, sweetie. Everyone has them." I nodded, not wanting to argue, but her words didn't comfort me. The nights that followed were worse. The shadow didn't appear every night, but its presence lingered. I started sleeping with every light in the room on, but even then, I could feel it watching me from the corners. Sometimes, I'd wake up to the sound of the whispers, faint but unmistakable, like they were coming from just outside my door. One night, I tried staying awake, determined to catch it before it could trap me in that paralyzed state again. I sat up in bed, my back against the wall, my eyes darting to every shadow in the room. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I started to think maybe it was finally over. But just as I began to relax, the air grew cold. My heart sank as the familiar heavy feeling settled over me. This time, I wasn't paralyzed, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My eyes were locked on the corner by the closet, where the shadow began to form once more. It didn't rise slowly this time. It surged forward, its form twisting and contorting as it rushed toward me. I screamed, the sound ripping from my throat before I could stop it. The shadow froze, its head snapping to the side as if it were surprised. Then, in an instant, it vanished. My parents burst into the room moments later, their faces pale with worry. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words caught in my throat. How could I make them understand? They looked around, finding nothing out of the ordinary, and told me it was just another bad dream. But I knew the truth. The shadow wasn't a dream. It was real, and it wasn't gone. It was waiting, lurking in the darkness, biding its time. And every night, as I lay in bed, I wonder when it will come back. It started the way most nights did. I climbed into bed around 11, scrolling on my phone until my eyes grew heavy. The faint hum of the fan in the corner and the occasional creak of the old house settling were the only sounds in my room. I liked it that way, quiet, predictable, safe. By midnight, I had drifted off, the phone slipping from my hand onto the mattress. The dream wasn't much of a dream, just vague flashes of random images that didn't make sense. I couldn't tell you what they were. They faded too quickly. What I do remember is waking up suddenly, my eyes snapping open like I'd been yanked out of the deepest part of sleep. The air felt wrong, like the room had been dipped into a vacuum where sound didn't exist. I tried to move, to roll onto my side, but my body didn't respond. My arms, legs, even my fingers felt like they were glued to the mattress. I panicked, my mind racing as I realized I couldn't even lift my head. The only thing I could control were my eyes, darting around the room in search of some explanation. At first, everything looked normal. The familiar shapes of my dresser, the open closet door, and the chair in the corner were all in their usual places. The moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting faint lines across the floor. But something felt off, like I wasn't alone. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that my mind was playing tricks on me because of the paralysis. I'd read about this before, how your brain can create hallucinations to fill the void when your body is stuck between sleep and waking. But then I heard it. A faint creak, barely audible but unmistakable, came from the corner of the room where the chair sat. My breath hitched, my chest tightening as I strained to see what might have caused it. That's when I saw the shadow. It wasn't like the shadows cast by the furniture or the light outside. This one was darker, denser, as if it absorbed the light around it. It sat in the chair, motionless at first, its shape indistinct. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears, I thought it might drown out everything else. Then it moved. The shadow shifted, its form stretching unnaturally as it stood up. It was tall, too tall, and impossibly thin, its limbs long and angular. Its head tilted slightly to the side, as if it were studying me, deciding what to do next. I wanted to scream, to call for my parents in the next room, but my throat wouldn't cooperate. The only sound I could make was a faint, wheezing gasp. My eyes stayed locked on the figure as it stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. It stopped at the foot of my bed, towering over me. The room felt colder, the kind of cold that bites into your skin and settles in your bones. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating. My chest felt like it was being crushed, each breath a struggle. Then it leaned forward. Its head loomed closer, close enough that I could feel the icy chill radiating from it. There were no features, no eyes or mouth, but I could feel it watching me, its attention sharp and unrelenting. My vision blurred as tears pooled in my eyes, the fear overwhelming. And then, the whispers began. They weren't coming from the shadow, not exactly. The sound filled the room, low and guttural, like voices speaking from all directions at once. The words were unintelligible, a chaotic jumble of syllables that made no sense. But the tone was clear, menacing, intrusive, like it was trying to force its way into my mind. The shadow moved closer, its form almost blending with the darkness around it. The whispers grew louder, their rhythm frantic, until it felt like they were inside my head. My whole body trembled with the effort of trying to move, to break free from the invisible chains holding me down. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the shadow stopped. It straightened, its head tilting in the other direction, as if it had just realized something. The whispers faded into silence, leaving the room eerily still. The shadow retreated, gliding backward into the corner where it had first appeared. Its form grew smaller, less distinct, until it melted into the darkness completely. The weight on my chest lifted, and I could finally move. I sat up, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. My hands trembled as I reached for the lamp on my bedside table, fumbling with the switch until the warm light filled the room. Everything looked normal again, exactly as it had before. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the shadow hadn't really left. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its form standing at the foot of my bed, felt the cold weight of its presence pressing down on me. I kept the lamp on until morning, my heart racing at every creak or shift of the house. The days that followed were no better. Even in broad daylight, I felt like I was being watched, like the shadow was lurking just out of sight. Nights were the worst. I started sleeping with every light in the room on, but it didn't help. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, paralyzed again, and the shadow would be there, waiting in the corner. It didn't always move or whisper, but its presence was enough to fill me with dread. I started dreading bedtime, staying up as late as I could until exhaustion forced me to sleep. But no matter how tired I was, the shadow always found me. One night, I decided to confront it. I told myself I'd stay awake, that I'd stare into the corner where it appeared and prove to myself it wasn't real. I sat up in bed, my back pressed against the wall, my eyes fixed on the chair. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just as I began to relax, thinking maybe it was over, the air shifted. The room grew colder, the silence heavier, and I knew it was there. My eyes locked on the corner as the shadow began to form, rising from the floor like smoke. This time, I didn't look away. I didn't let myself panic, even as it stood up and turned toward me. I whispered under my breath, over and over, "You're not real. You're not real." But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. The shadow stopped halfway across the room, its form flickering like a candle flame. For a moment, I thought it might disappear, but instead, it tilted its head, almost as if it were acknowledging me. Then it turned and melted back into the darkness, leaving me shaking and wide-eyed in the light of my bedside lamp. I haven't seen the shadow in weeks, but I know it's not gone. Sometimes, late at night, I feel the cold weight of its presence lingering in the room, even though I can't see it. And every time I wake up to the creak of the chair in the corner, I wonder if it's just waiting for the right moment to return. It was supposed to be an ordinary night. I had stayed up late finishing a paper for school, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever. By the time I crawled into bed, it was nearly 1 a.m., and my body felt like it was sinking into the mattress. The glow from my laptop had faded, leaving the room in darkness except for a faint sliver of moonlight slipping through the gap in the curtains. I pulled the blankets up to my chin, yawned deeply, and let myself drift off. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I woke up, but it was abrupt. One moment, I was in a dreamless void, and the next, I was wide awake. My eyes opened to the same dark room, everything still and silent, yet something felt wrong. My body was stiff, heavier than I'd ever felt before, and when I tried to roll over, I couldn't move. Panic set in quickly. I tried again, willing my arms to lift or my legs to shift, but it was like I'd been pinned to the bed by invisible weights. I couldn't even move my head to look around. My heart raced and my breathing quickened, though even that felt shallow and constrained, like there was something pressing down on my chest. I'd heard of sleep paralysis before. Friends had joked about it, calling it the waking nightmare, but I'd never experienced it myself. Knowing what it was should have calmed me, but it didn't. The sensation of being completely trapped in my own body was too terrifying to rationalize away. My eyes darted around the room, the only part of me that could move. At first, everything looked normal. The desk piled with books and papers, the half-open closet door, and the chair in the corner where I had tossed my hoodie earlier. They were all where they should be. But then I noticed the shadows. In the corner, where the light from the window didn't quite reach, the darkness seemed deeper. It wasn't just a lack of light. It was something more. The shadow there seemed to shift and ripple, like it was alive. I stared at it, unblinking, hoping it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But as the seconds stretched on, the shape began to change. It grew taller, rising slowly, unnaturally, until it almost touched the ceiling. My breath caught as the shadow began to take form. A head, shoulders, long arms. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its proportions were distorted, the arms too long and the head too smooth. It didn't have a face, but I felt its attention fix on me, sharp and predatory. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but my voice was trapped just like the rest of me. All I could do was watch as the shadow stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Each step brought it closer, the darkness around it seeming to stretch and crawl across the walls. The air in the room changed, growing colder with each passing moment. It was the kind of cold that wasn't just physical. It felt like it seeped into my soul, hollowing me out from the inside. The shadow stopped at the foot of my bed, towering over me. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst, but the rest of me remained frozen, helpless. The silence was unbearable. I could hear nothing but the blood rushing in my ears and the faint creak of the bed under my weight. Then, without warning, the shadow leaned down. Its featureless head came closer, stopping inches from my face. I could feel the cold radiating from it, and though it had no eyes, I knew it was staring directly into mine. That's when the whispers began. They were soft at first, barely audible, but they grew louder, more insistent. The voices overlapped, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, the tones harsh and guttural. It felt like they were burrowing into my brain, each word clawing at my sanity. The shadow didn't move, but the voices seemed to come from everywhere. Inside the walls, the floor, even inside my own head. Tears streamed down my face as I fought against the paralysis with everything I had. My fingers twitched, but it wasn't enough. The whispers grew louder still, until it felt like they were shouting, filling every inch of the room. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The shadow straightened, its form looming impossibly tall. For a moment, it simply stood there, silent and still. Then it turned, gliding back to the corner where it had first appeared. Its shape dissolved into the darkness, leaving nothing but the faint outlines of the room behind. The weight lifted from my chest, and I sat up with a gasp, my body trembling violently. My hands were clammy, and my heartbeat echoed in my ears like a drum. I scrambled to turn on the lamp beside my bed, flooding the room with warm, golden light. Everything looked normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, hiding just beyond the reach of the light. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, my eyes glued to the corner where the shadow had disappeared. The next day, I tried to convince myself it had all been a nightmare, some vivid hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The memory of the shadow and the whispers was too real, too vivid to dismiss. Over the following weeks, the visits became more frequent. Some nights, I'd wake up paralyzed again, the shadow standing in its usual corner, watching. Other nights, I'd hear the whispers before I even opened my eyes, the sound pulling me from sleep like a cruel joke. I started sleeping with every light in the room on, even the harsh fluorescent lamp on my desk. But it didn't help. The shadow always found a way, its form darker and more oppressive than the light could penetrate. One night, I decided to confront it. I stayed awake, forcing myself to keep my eyes open as the hours ticked by. When the whispers began, faint and distant, I didn't look away. When the shadow appeared in the corner, I stared at it, refusing to let fear take over. The shadow seemed to notice. It hesitated, its form flickering slightly before stepping forward. My heart pounded, but I held my ground, whispering to myself, "You're not real. You're not real." The shadow stopped halfway across the room, its head tilting as if confused. For a moment, the whispers stopped too, leaving the room eerily quiet. Then, slowly, the shadow retreated, dissolving into the corner once more. I didn't feel victorious. The fear didn't leave, and the sense of being watched never went away. But the shadow hasn't appeared since that night, though I still hear the whispers sometimes, faint and distant, like a warning. Even now, as I write this, I can feel the weight of its presence lurking in the edges of my mind. I leave the lights on when I sleep, but the darkness always finds a way. And every night, I wonder if the shadow is truly gone or just waiting for the right moment to return. It began on a night like any other, one of those nights where you don't expect anything unusual. I had gone to bed around 10, exhausted after a long day of school and chores. The house was quiet, and the faint hum of the central heating system provided a kind of white noise that usually lulled me to sleep. As I lay there, I felt myself drifting off, the heaviness of sleep pulling me down like a warm, comforting tide. My last conscious thought was how peaceful everything felt. But peace doesn't last forever, and neither did my sleep. I woke up to a stillness that was too complete, a silence that felt unnatural. My body wouldn't move. At first, I thought it was just one of those moments where you're half asleep and your brain hasn't fully woken up. But as the seconds ticked by, I realized this was different. My arms, my legs, even my neck. It was like my entire body had been locked in place. I wanted to panic, to scream, but my mouth wouldn't open. The only thing I could move was my eyes, and they darted around the room in a desperate attempt to figure out what was happening. Everything looked the same as when I had fallen asleep. The familiar outlines of my desk, the bookshelves, and the slightly open closet door were all there. But the room didn't feel the same. The air was heavy, like it was pressing down on me, and the darkness seemed thicker, deeper. My breathing quickened, though it came out shallow and strained, as if something invisible was sitting on my chest. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, where the light from the street lamp outside didn't quite reach, the shadows moved. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, some trick of the faint light and my own fear. But as I stared, the shadows began to shift, coalescing into a form. It rose slowly, stretching upward until it was impossibly tall. The figure was blacker than the darkness around it, like it was absorbing all the light in the room. It had no face, no features, just an outline that suggested a humanoid shape. Long arms, broad shoulders, and a head that seemed to tilt slightly to the side as it regarded me. I couldn't look away. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but my body remained paralyzed. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. With each step, the air grew colder, and I could feel a chill spreading through my limbs, even though I couldn't move them. The figure stopped at the foot of my bed, towering over me. My eyes strained to follow its movements as it leaned down, its head coming closer and closer until it was hovering just above mine. There was no sound, no breath, no noise at all, but I felt its presence as clearly as if it were pressing into me. Then the whispers began. They were soft at first, barely audible, like a breeze rustling through leaves. But they grew louder, and the sound wasn't natural. The voices overlapped, dozens of them speaking at once in a language I didn't recognize. The tone was sharp and guttural, each word filled with malice. My mind screamed at my body to move, to fight, to do anything, but I was trapped, a prisoner in my own skin. Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision as the whispers continued to claw at my sanity. I wanted to close my eyes, to shut it all out, but I couldn't. The figure didn't move, but the whispers seemed to be coming from it, or maybe from everywhere at once. They filled the room, pressing against my ears until it felt like my head might explode. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figure straightened. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The figure tilted its head again, as if studying me, deciding what to do next. Then, slowly, it turned and moved back toward the corner where it had first appeared. Its form seemed to dissolve into the shadows, blending with the darkness until it was gone. The paralysis broke. I sat up with a gasp, my body trembling and drenched in sweat. My chest ached, my breaths coming in ragged gasps as I scrambled to turn on the bedside lamp. The room flooded with light, and everything looked normal again. The corner was empty, just as it should be, but I didn't feel safe. For the rest of the night, I sat with my back against the headboard, my eyes glued to the corner where the figure had vanished. Every creak of the house, every shift of the shadows, made my heart race. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a nightmare, a vivid hallucination brought on by stress or exhaustion. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I had felt its presence, the weight of its gaze, the cold air it brought with it. That wasn't something my mind could have made up. Over the next few nights, I started sleeping with a lamp on, but the light didn't help. I would wake up paralyzed again, the whispers already starting before I could open my eyes. The figure didn't always appear, but its presence was always there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I stayed up as long as I could, forcing myself to remain awake until my body begged for sleep. But the moment I closed my eyes, it began again. This time, the figure didn't wait. As soon as I woke up, it was there, standing at the foot of my bed. The whispers were louder, more urgent, and the air felt heavier than ever. My body refused to move, no matter how much I struggled. I stared at the figure, trying to will it away, to make it disappear. I repeated over and over in my mind, "You're not real. You're not real." But the figure didn't budge. Then, for the first time, it reached out. One of its long, shadowy arms extended toward me, its fingers impossibly thin and sharp. My breath hitched as its hand stopped just above my chest. I could feel the cold radiating from it, the kind of cold that burns. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't like the whispers. It was low and resonant, a single word that echoed in my mind. Mine. The word reverberated through me, and the next thing I knew, I was awake. Fully awake. The room was bright, the lamp still on, and everything was as it should be. But the memory of that word lingered, etched into my mind. I haven't slept properly since. Even now, I feel its presence in the corner of my room, watching, waiting. The lamp stays on all night, but the shadows are always there, just beyond the light. And every so often, when the house is silent and the air grows cold, I hear the faintest whisper of that word again. Mine. It started when I was about 14. I had always been someone who could sleep through anything, from thunderstorms to the noise of cars driving by at night. My room was my sanctuary, and I always felt safe in it, no matter how dark it got. But that all changed one night. I remember it vividly, like it was yesterday. I had fallen asleep after a long day of school, and the usual tiredness of a teenager had set in. I snuggled under my blankets, my head hitting the pillow, and within minutes, I drifted off. I woke up in the middle of the night, but something was wrong. I couldn't move. It wasn't like I was sleeping. I could feel my body, but I couldn't control it. My muscles were frozen, and I could barely even blink. Panic started to rise inside me as I realized that I was awake, but unable to do anything. The room around me was dark, but it was a familiar darkness, the kind you know well when you've been in a room for years. And then, I saw it. In the far corner of the room, a figure stood. It was completely black, a shadowy form that seemed to blend into the darkness of the night. I tried to scream, tried to call out for help, but my voice was trapped in my throat. It was like there was an invisible weight pressing down on me, preventing me from moving, from making any sound. The figure didn't move, not at first. It just stood there, tall and unnaturally still. I could feel its gaze on me, though it didn't have any eyes. There was something so wrong about it. The shape was human in size, but its proportions were distorted. The arms were too long, the head slightly too large. The darkness around it seemed to twist, making it even harder to focus. I could hear a faint whisper, but it was incomprehensible, like a language I'd never heard before, low and guttural. Every second felt like an eternity. I tried to look away, to focus on anything else, but I couldn't. My eyes wouldn't leave it. I could feel it getting closer, though it didn't seem to move. It was like it was closing in on me, suffocating the space between us. Suddenly, the room felt colder. The temperature dropped so quickly I could see my breath fogging in the air, though the windows were closed. My body trembled uncontrollably, though I still couldn't move. My heart raced, the sound of it pounding in my chest so loud I thought it might burst. But the shadow just stood there, motionless, its presence overwhelming. I don't know how long it stayed there, watching me. It felt like hours, though I'm sure it was only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow seemed to retreat back into the corner of the room, dissolving into the darkness. I could feel the weight lifting off me, and I was able to move again. My limbs ached as I sat up in bed, gasping for air like I had been holding my breath for too long. I immediately reached for the light on my bedside table, fumbling to turn it on. The room was just as I had left it. Nothing was out of place. The shadow was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't really gone anywhere. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there, staring at the corner where it had been, waiting for it to come back. The next few nights were more of the same. I would fall asleep, and then in the middle of the night, I'd wake up paralyzed, unable to move, unable to scream. The shadow would be there, standing in the corner of the room, watching me. Each time, it felt like it was closer, like it was learning how to move, how to get closer to me. It wasn't just the shadow anymore. As the days passed, I started to hear things. Soft whispers, too quiet to make out any words. It sounded like someone was speaking right next to me, though when I turned to look, no one was there. And sometimes, I'd hear footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking around my room, circling my bed. But whenever I looked, the room would be empty, just the way it had been before. I started staying up later and later, trying to avoid sleep altogether. But eventually, the exhaustion would win. The sleep paralysis became a regular thing. Every time I closed my eyes, it was like I was trapped in that waking nightmare. The shadow would return, always in the same corner, always watching. The whispers grew louder. The footsteps got closer. One night, I woke up to the feeling of something heavy on my chest. My eyes shot open, but my body was still frozen. The weight pressing down on me was suffocating. And then, I heard it. A voice, clear as day, right next to my ear. Leave. The whisper wasn't like the others. It was deep, so deep it almost sounded like it was coming from inside my head. The word was simple, but it felt like a command, a demand. I wanted to scream, to tell it to go away, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't listen. And then, just as suddenly, the weight lifted. The shadow disappeared. The room was silent again. I didn't know what to think anymore. Was it a dream? Was I imagining it all? The feeling of the weight on my chest, the whispers, the figure in the corner. It all felt so real, but I couldn't explain it. I couldn't make sense of it. The next few nights, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake, trying to force my mind to stay alert. But every time I drifted off, I felt the pressure in my chest again, the whispers in my ear, the shadow in the corner. It was like the room itself was alive, filled with things I couldn't see but could always feel. Then, one night, I decided to fight back. I wasn't going to let it control me anymore. I stayed awake all night, staring at the corner where the shadow always appeared, willing myself to stay conscious. But as the hours dragged on, I felt my eyelids growing heavy. I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. And just as I thought I had one, I slipped into sleep. This time, when I woke up, the room was different. It wasn't the same safe place I had always known. The air was thick, and the darkness felt like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel the shadow before I saw it. It was right there, in the corner. But it wasn't just standing there anymore. The shadow had grown. It had become something more. Its form stretched out, growing taller and wider, until it filled the entire corner of the room. The whispers were louder, more frantic, like a chant. The footsteps, too, were closer, so close that I could feel them on the floor beneath me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The pressure in the room was overwhelming. Leave now, the voice growled, deeper than ever before. The shadow's form reached out, its long, dark arms stretching toward me. I could feel it, feel the coldness radiating from it, the touch that was like ice, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, locked in fear. But then, just as it seemed to be reaching for me, I screamed. I didn't even realize I was screaming, but I felt my voice rip through the silence. I screamed as loud as I could, and suddenly, the weight was gone. The room lightened. The shadow retreated, dissolving back into the corner. The whispers stopped. The footsteps faded. I woke up the next morning, drenched in sweat, but the room was empty again. There was no shadow, no whispers, no footsteps, but I knew something had changed. It wasn't over. I don't know if it ever will be. I still hear the whispers sometimes. I still feel that cold presence in the corner, watching. And even though the shadow hasn't come back in a while, I can't help but feel like it's just waiting for the right moment. And I'll be ready. Because one thing I know for sure is that it's not gone. It's just waiting for me to fall asleep again. It was a normal Tuesday evening when it all started. I was just a typical 17-year-old, trying to navigate the whirlwind of school, sports, and life in general. My room was small, but it was my sanctuary, quiet, private, and familiar. I had grown accustomed to its stillness, to the comfort of the walls that knew every turn I made, every habit I had. I loved the way it felt to lay down at night, the weight of the covers pulling me into a deep, unbothered sleep. Or at least, that's how it used to be. I had been getting a lot of stress from school lately, trying to manage my grades and my extracurriculars. Late night studying were becoming more frequent, and it wasn't long before my sleep schedule started to deteriorate. I could feel the exhaustion creeping up on me, but I was too busy to stop and rest. Every morning, I dragged myself out of bed, not quite ready to face the day, but pushing myself through anyway. One particular night, I had stayed up late to finish an assignment that was due the next day. I felt myself nodding off as I sat at my desk, but I forced my eyes to stay open. Eventually, I gave in and decided to call it a night. I turned off the light, crawled under the blankets, and closed my eyes. The moment I drifted off to sleep, I felt something shift. I wasn't sure if I had woken up or not, but I found myself lying in my bed, unable to move. My body was stiff, and no matter how much I willed myself to move a finger or even blink, nothing happened. It was like my mind had awakened, but my body was still in the grip of sleep. I had heard about sleep paralysis before, but experiencing it for myself was a different story. Panic began to build inside me. My heart raced, and my breathing became shallow. I could hear every beat in my chest. The room was quiet, except for the sound of my own breath and the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. For a few moments, I thought it might pass, that this was just one of those strange, passing moments where my brain was still caught between the waking world and sleep. But then, I heard something. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was walking down the hallway just outside my room. I tried to turn my head to see if anyone was there, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in my own body. The footsteps continued, each one echoing through the stillness of the house. The air in the room felt thicker, colder. My breath caught in my throat. The steps stopped outside my door, and then I heard the faintest creak of the doorknob turning. My heart pounded against my ribcage. Whoever, or whatever, was outside was getting closer. Then, the door creaked open. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The presence in the room grew. A chill ran down my spine, and I swear I could feel something watching me. The darkness in the room felt heavier, like it was closing in. The air seemed to suffocate me, pressing down on my chest. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to move, to get up and run, but my body refused to cooperate. And then, I saw it. In the doorway, there was something standing. It was tall, dark, and seemed to absorb the light around it, blending into the shadows of the room. Its shape was humanoid, but it didn't look quite right. The figure was too tall, its limbs too long, and it had an eerie, unnatural stillness. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark, shrouded form that seemed to melt into the surrounding shadows. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching me. The whispering began then, low and almost inaudible at first. It was a voice. No, multiple voices, murmuring something I couldn't understand. I could feel the words in my mind, like a presence trying to communicate, but the language was foreign, twisted. I could almost feel the weight of the words pressing on my brain, urging me to listen, to understand. The figure started to move then, slowly gliding toward the edge of my bed. Its presence was suffocating, the air in the room growing colder and heavier with each step it took. The whispers became clearer, louder, like they were coming from everywhere at once. And then it was beside me. I could feel it, its presence next to me, though I could still only see the shadow of it. The figure leaned down, its dark form hovering over me, just inches away from my face. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. All I could do was lie there, trapped in the terrifying stillness of the moment. The whispers stopped. Silence hung in the air like a thick fog. For a moment, I thought it was over, that it was gone. But the silence didn't feel like relief. It felt like anticipation, like something was waiting, something was preparing to do something terrible. And then, I felt it. A cold, clammy hand brushed against my arm. It was like ice, freezing and unnatural. The touch was light, but the sensation was enough to send a wave of terror crashing over me. I wanted to scream, to fight, but nothing happened. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own body, as the hand slid down my arm, leaving a cold trail in its wake. The figure pulled away then, stepping back into the corner of the room. The air slowly returned to normal, and I could feel the tension in the room begin to dissipate. I was still frozen, still unable to move, but the figure was gone. The door was slowly creaking closed, and the whispers faded into nothingness. And just like that, the paralysis lifted. I shot up in bed, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My heart was still pounding, my breathing shallow and erratic. The room was dark, and everything was as it should be, except for the overwhelming sense of dread that hung in the air. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, darker, as if they were hiding something. I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone at all. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, watching the door, the corners of the room, waiting for it to come back. The sound of my own breath was the only thing that filled the silence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't gone. It had been in my room, and it would come back. The next few nights were a blur of restless sleep, and each time I woke up, I was paralyzed again. The same figure would be there, lurking in the doorway, or standing in the corner of the room, its presence suffocating me. The whispers, the cold touch, the feeling of being watched. It became a nightly ritual. I couldn't escape it. Every time I thought I might be free, it returned, more persistent than before. And then, one night, it didn't stop at the doorway. I woke up to find it standing beside my bed, just inches from me. The whispers were louder, almost deafening now, and for the first time, I heard a voice, a single, low voice that spoke directly into my ear. "You're mine." The words sent a chill straight through me, deeper than anything I had ever felt. I tried to scream, to move, but I couldn't. The room was too cold, the shadows too thick. The figure reached out, its cold, clammy hand touching my arm again, sending waves of fear through me. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The figure vanished, and I was left in the silence of my own room, heart pounding, chest heaving, body trembling. I don't know what it was, or why it chose me, but ever since that night, I've been haunted by that shadow, by the cold touch, by the whispers that still echo in my mind. The figure never fully leaves me. It waits in the shadows, just beyond the corner of my vision, just beyond the light. I can feel it watching me, waiting for the right moment to come back. And every time I close my eyes, I wonder if tonight will be the night it returns for good. It started on a Wednesday night. I had always been a deep sleeper, one of those people who could fall asleep anywhere and not wake up until morning. But that night, something was different. I had stayed up late studying for a chemistry exam, so when I finally crawled into bed, I was exhausted. The moment my head hit the pillow, I slipped into an almost instant, dreamless sleep. But then, I woke up. I wasn't sure if I had actually woken up or if I was still dreaming. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the dark shadows from my room's furniture casting strange shapes across the walls. My body felt heavy, and it was like I couldn't move, like some unseen force was holding me down. I tried to wiggle my fingers or move my toes, but nothing happened. The room was eerily silent. Not even the usual creaks of the house at night could be heard. I thought I might be having a strange dream, but the more I tried to move, the more panic built up inside me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the pressure building in my head, but still, I couldn't move. The fear began to spread, like cold water trickling down my spine. That's when I heard it. A soft sound, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and completely out of place. The house was supposed to be quiet at this hour. My family was asleep, and the only noise usually came from the wind outside or the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. But these footsteps were different. They were too heavy, too slow, like someone was walking with purpose, right outside my door. The sound stopped just beyond my bedroom door. My heart raced faster, and I felt that unmistakable rush of terror. Someone was outside, but why couldn't I move? Why couldn't I scream? I lay there, helpless, listening to the footsteps, waiting for the door to open. But the door didn't open. Instead, I could hear it. Something breathing. Slow, deliberate breaths, in sync with the pacing outside my room. Then, something shifted. The shadows in the corners of my room seemed to deepen, becoming more pronounced, as if they were alive and stretching toward me. The air grew thick, and for a moment, I felt as if I couldn't breathe. It was suffocating, the pressure unbearable. I could feel the weight of something pressing on my chest, as though an invisible hand was slowly crushing the air out of my lungs. Panic surged inside me, but still, I couldn't move. The breathing outside my door grew louder, and I could feel it moving closer, inch by inch. I don't know how long I lay there, but it felt like forever. Then, the footsteps started again, closer this time. There was no escaping it. I could feel it, the presence. The air was now unnaturally cold, and I felt the room around me warping, like reality itself was bending under the weight of whatever this was. And then, I saw it. The shadow. At first, it was just a shift in the darkness, barely noticeable. But then, the shadow seemed to grow. It stretched upward, filling the doorway to my room, its shape taller than anything human. It was blacker than the night, and it seemed to swallow all the light in the room. The figure wasn't fully defined. Its edges blurred, like smoke, shifting and flickering, but I could feel its presence in the room, overwhelming and suffocating. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze on me. The intensity of the stare was so strong that it was almost suffocating, like the shadow was pulling at my very soul. My heart pounded against my chest, and I fought desperately to move, to scream. But still, my body was paralyzed. It was as though the shadow was holding me down, keeping me in place, keeping me trapped in this waking nightmare. Then, it started to move. The shadow didn't walk. It glided. It shifted smoothly, like it was floating above the ground, crossing the room with unnerving silence. Every inch it moved closer to me felt like an eternity. The air grew colder, the weight heavier. I could feel it now, right next to me. I couldn't see it, but I could sense its presence just inches from my face, its dark, oppressive energy closing in on me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. The paralysis was too strong. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, like I was suffocating, but there was nothing I could do. I could hear it now, the sound of breathing, but it wasn't coming from the shadow. It was coming from behind me. There, in the darkness, I could sense something else, something worse. I didn't dare look behind me. If I did, I was sure I would see something far worse than the shadow in front of me. I could feel it in my bones. The terror was almost physical, like it was crawling beneath my skin. The presence behind me was so much darker, so much more malevolent than the shadow. I could feel it, creeping closer, almost touching the back of my head. The shadow loomed over me now, its shape growing more solid, more defined. It was as though it was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every second I lay there, unable to move. I could hear its slow, deliberate breathing now. It was so close, I could almost reach out and touch it. Then, I felt a hand. It wasn't a physical hand, but it was the sensation of something icy cold and heavy pressing against my arm. It was like ice water seeping into my skin, and I could feel the cold spreading through me. The hand was cold, cold beyond any temperature I had ever known. It didn't let go. The pressure was unbearable, as though the shadow was trying to pull me into itself. My body shook with terror, but still, I couldn't move. The figure seemed to pause for a moment, hovering over me. I couldn't see its face, but I felt it, the presence, the intention. It wasn't just watching me. It was waiting. waiting for something. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like hours. The room was frozen, and the cold was unbearable. My breath came in shallow gasps, and the pressure in my chest was suffocating. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the figure seemed to fade. It didn't leave immediately. It lingered for a moment, but it was as if the very essence of it dissolved into the darkness, melting away into nothing. The weight lifted from my chest. The room warmed, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift. I could move again. I could breathe, but I wasn't safe. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, listening for any sounds, watching the shadows in the corners of my room. I kept the light on, just in case it came back, but I couldn't escape the feeling that it was still there, watching me from the darkness. The next few nights were the same. I would fall asleep, and then I would wake up, paralyzed. The footsteps would begin again, slow and deliberate, and the shadow would return, getting closer and closer every time. The whispers started too, soft at first, then louder, as if they were calling me by name. It was as if the shadow was not just watching me. It was feeding on my fear, growing stronger with each encounter. And then, one night, it was different. I woke up, like usual, paralyzed and unable to move. But this time, there was no shadow at the door. There was no figure in the corner. The room was empty. I thought maybe I was finally free. Maybe it had all been a nightmare. But as I lay there, staring into the darkness, I felt something cold brush against my hand. The shadow had never really left. It had only been waiting for me to fall asleep again. It began on a night like any other. The world outside my window was quiet, with only the occasional rustle of wind in the trees breaking the stillness. I had gone to bed late after scrolling endlessly through my phone, the blue light of the screen burning into my tired eyes. Sleep came quickly, dragging me down into its comforting abyss. But what followed that night would change the way I felt about sleep forever. I woke up suddenly, though I wasn't sure why. My body felt heavy, like it was pinned to the bed. At first, I thought I must be dreaming. The darkness of the room felt oppressive, thicker than usual, as though it was pressing down on me. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. My arms were stuck at my sides, my legs unmoving beneath the blanket. Even my fingers wouldn't budge. Panic bubbled up in my chest as I struggled against the invisible weight. I tried to scream, to call out for my parents in the room down the hall, but no sound came out. My throat felt closed, as though something was squeezing it tight. I could only lie there, paralyzed, my wide eyes scanning the room for answers. That's when I noticed the shadows. At first, they seemed like nothing more than the usual darkness pooling in the corners of my room, shaped by the dim moonlight filtering through the curtains. But the longer I stared, the more I realized these shadows weren't just shadows. They were moving, shifting slowly like they were alive. One shadow in particular caught my attention. It was darker than the others, standing out against the wall near my closet. The shadow was tall, unnaturally so, with a shape that didn't quite make sense. It was like a person, but its limbs were too long, its body too thin. It didn't seem to have a face, just a void where its features should be. Yet, despite the absence of eyes, I could feel it watching me. The air in the room grew colder, and my heart pounded in my chest. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead, trickling down the sides of my face. I wanted to shut my eyes, to block out the sight of the shadow, but I couldn't look away. My body betrayed me, leaving me helpless and vulnerable under its gaze. The shadow began to move, gliding across the room without a sound. Its form seemed to ripple, like smoke caught in an invisible wind. It stopped at the foot of my bed, looming over me. I could feel its presence now, heavy and suffocating, like it was draining the air from the room. And then it bent down. It leaned closer, its formless face hovering just inches from mine. The cold radiating from its body was unbearable, seeping through my skin and into my bones. I tried to scream again, to thrash and fight, but nothing happened. I was a prisoner in my own body, forced to endure the terror of this thing that shouldn't exist. The shadow didn't touch me, but I could feel it. Its malice, its hunger. It was as though it was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with each panicked breath I managed to take. And then, I heard it. A voice, faint and raspy, whispered into my ear. The words were unintelligible, a guttural language I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was threatening, a warning, or perhaps a promise of something far worse to come. Tears streamed down my face as the shadow straightened up, retreating slightly but never leaving the room. It stood there, watching me for what felt like an eternity, its form blending into the darkness. Finally, the weight pressing down on me lifted, and I was able to move again. I bolted upright, gasping for air, my chest heaving as I clutched the blanket to my chest. The shadow was gone. The room was empty, but the air still felt heavy, tainted by its presence. I turned on the bedside lamp, the warm light flooding the room and banishing the darkness. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, too afraid that if I closed my eyes, the shadow would return. Over the next few nights, the same thing happened. I would fall asleep, only to wake up paralyzed, unable to move or speak. The shadow was always there, lurking in the corners of my room, watching me with its unseen eyes. Each time, it came closer, standing by my bed or leaning over me, its whispers growing louder and more insistent. I started to dread the nights, staying awake as long as I could, hoping to outrun the inevitable. But no matter how long I stayed awake, sleep would always claim me eventually, and the shadow would be waiting. One night, I decided to fight back. Armed with a flashlight and my phone, I stayed up, determined to confront whatever was haunting me. Midnight came and went, and I sat in bed, my eyes fixed on the corner where the shadow usually appeared. For hours, nothing happened, and I began to wonder if it had finally left me alone. But then, just as I was beginning to relax, the room grew cold again. The shadows in the corners deepened, and I felt the familiar weight settle over me. My flashlight flickered and went out, leaving me in darkness. I fumbled for my phone, the glow of the screen barely illuminating the room. The shadow was there, standing at the foot of my bed. I pointed the phone's light at it, hoping the brightness would drive it away. But the shadow didn't move. Instead, it seemed to absorb the light, growing darker and more solid. My hands trembled as I held the phone, my heart racing in my chest. "Leave me alone," I managed to croak, my voice barely above a whisper. The shadow didn't respond. It just stood there, its presence overwhelming. And then, it lunged. The phone slipped from my hands as the shadow surged forward, engulfing me in its darkness. The cold was unbearable, and I felt like I was drowning, suffocating under its weight. The whispers were deafening now, echoing in my mind, a chorus of voices speaking in that same guttural language. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the shadow pulled back, retreating into the corner of the room. The air warmed, and I was able to breathe again. But I knew it wasn't over. The shadow wasn't gone. It was still there, waiting for me to let my guard down. I didn't sleep that night or the nights that followed. The shadow didn't return immediately, but I could feel its presence, lurking just out of sight. The darkness in my room felt alive, like it was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I don't know what it is or why it chose me, but every time I close my eyes, I see it, standing in the corner, its formless shape blending into the shadows. It's always there, a silent watcher in the dark, reminding me that I'm never truly alone. It started during the summer after I graduated high school, a time when I thought my biggest worry would be deciding what to do with my future. My parents had gone on a weekend trip, leaving me alone in the house. I was excited for the solitude, imagining nights of binging movies and staying up as late as I wanted. I didn't know then how much I would regret it. The first night, everything was normal. I stayed up late, watched a couple of horror movies, and scrolled on my phone until my eyes grew heavy. By the time I crawled into bed, I was so tired I barely remembered pulling the blanket over me. Sleep came quickly, deep and dreamless, until I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the comforting quiet of a house at rest. It was the kind of silence that felt wrong, oppressive, like the air itself had frozen in place. My bedroom felt unusually cold, and as I tried to sit up, I realized I couldn't move. My arms, legs, even my head. Everything was completely still. It was as though an invisible force had pinned me to the bed. At first, I thought I was dreaming. It felt surreal, like one of those moments when you know you're awake but your mind is convinced otherwise. I tried to move my fingers, to shift my head, but my body refused to obey. That's when I noticed the shadows. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated my room just enough for me to see the outlines of the furniture, the door, and the corners. But something was off. The shadows weren't where they should be. The one by my closet was larger than normal, and it seemed to stretch unnaturally upward, almost like it was standing. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, it was still there. It was darker than the other shadows, almost blacker than black, and it seemed to move ever so slightly, shifting and swaying like smoke trapped in a jar. I tried to call out, but my voice wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, like something was squeezing it. Panic began to set in as I realized I was completely at the mercy of whatever this was. My eyes darted around the room, desperate for a sign that this was all just a nightmare. But the shadow near the closet started to move. It didn't walk. It glided, silent and deliberate, across the room. Its form was undefined, but there was something inherently human about its shape, too tall, its arms too long, and its movements unnervingly smooth. It stopped near the foot of my bed, and though it had no face, I could feel it staring at me. The air in the room grew colder, so cold that I could see my breath in the faint moonlight. My chest felt heavy, as though something was pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. And then, I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, so soft I almost thought it was my imagination. But then it grew louder, the sound sharp and grating, like wind through broken glass. The whisper wasn't in any language I recognized. It was guttural, harsh, and filled with an undeniable malice. The shadow leaned closer, and for the first time, I could see it in detail. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something alive, its surface rippling like liquid, constantly shifting and reforming. The closer it got, the colder the air became, until I felt like my skin was freezing solid. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, like it was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand. All I knew was the overwhelming sense of dread that filled every corner of my mind. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as I tried desperately to wake myself up. And then, the shadow moved again. It reached out, its arms stretching unnaturally long as it hovered just above my chest. Though it didn't touch me, I felt its presence, an icy pressure that made it hard to breathe. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that was somehow even worse. The shadow stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, its form looming over me, its weight pressing down on my chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it retreated. It slid back into the corner near the closet, its shape dissolving into the darkness until it was gone. The paralysis lifted, and I gasped for air, my chest heaving as I sat up in bed. My hands were trembling, my skin slick with sweat despite the cold. I looked around the room, half expecting the shadow to reappear, but everything was still. I told myself it was just a dream, some bizarre hallucination brought on by stress or exhaustion. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The fear I felt was too real, too visceral. The next night, I was afraid to go to sleep. I left the lights on, the TV playing quietly in the background to keep the silence at bay. But eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. It happened again. I woke up to the same heavy paralysis, the same unnatural cold. This time, the shadow didn't wait. It was already at the foot of my bed, its dark form even larger than before. The whispering started immediately, louder and more urgent. I could feel it pulling at me, like it was trying to drag me into the darkness with it. The pressure on my chest was unbearable, and I could barely breathe. I fought against the paralysis, straining with every ounce of strength I had, but it was no use. The shadow leaned closer, its formless face inches from mine. For a moment, I thought I could see something in the darkness, eyes glowing faintly like embers in a dying fire. And then, it spoke. The whisper was clear this time, though still in that guttural, unfamiliar language. I didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. It was a warning. The shadow lingered for a moment longer before retreating, its form dissolving into the shadows once again. When the paralysis lifted, I sat up, shaking and gasping for air. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, or the nights that followed. I kept the lights on, stayed awake as long as I could, but the shadow always returned. Each time, it grew bolder, its whispers louder, its presence more oppressive. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but every night, I can feel it watching, waiting in the dark. The shadows in my room no longer feel like shadows. They feel like eyes, always there, always watching. I'm afraid to sleep now. I'm afraid of the silence, the cold, and the whispers. But most of all, I'm afraid of the day when the shadow finally decides to stop retreating. It was the summer of my junior year when I first encountered it. My family had recently moved to a new house, an old place with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper that seemed to whisper of its age. The neighbors called it charming, but to me, it felt unsettling. The ceilings were too high, the hallways too narrow, and the shadows seemed to linger a little too long in the corners. The first few nights in the house were uneventful. I was tired from unpacking and adjusting to the new space, so I would collapse into bed and fall asleep almost immediately. But one night, just as I was drifting off, I felt something strange. I woke up in the middle of the night, though I couldn't figure out why. The room was pitch black, the kind of darkness that makes you question if your eyes are open. I tried to reach for my phone to check the time, but my arm wouldn't move. In fact, nothing would. My body was completely paralyzed. At first, I thought I was dreaming. I'd heard about sleep paralysis before, read stories about people who felt trapped in their own bodies. But this wasn't just a dream. It felt too real, too vivid. The weight pressing down on my chest was suffocating, as though something heavy was sitting on top of me. I tried to calm myself, to convince myself it would pass, but then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of my vision, was a shadow. It was tall and narrow, almost blending into the darkness of the room, but not quite. There was something unnatural about its shape, something wrong. It didn't look like it belonged there, like it wasn't a part of the shadows, but something separate entirely. The longer I stared, the more I realized it was watching me. It didn't have eyes, not in the way people do, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking. My heart raced as I tried to move, to scream, to do anything to break the stillness, but my body refused to respond. The shadow began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped out of the corner and into the middle of the room. It didn't walk, exactly. It glided, its form shifting slightly with every movement, as though it were made of smoke. It stopped at the foot of my bed, looming over me, its presence overwhelming. I tried to look away, to close my eyes, but I couldn't. My gaze was locked on the shadow as it leaned closer, its head tilting in a way that felt almost curious. The air around me grew colder, and the faint sound of whispering filled the room. At first, the whispers were too soft to make out, like a distant wind. But as the shadow leaned closer, they grew louder. The words were foreign, harsh, and guttural, yet I understood their intent. It wasn't just speaking. It was reaching out, trying to pull me into its darkness. I could feel my panic rising, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The weight on my chest grew heavier, and for a moment, I thought I might suffocate. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The shadow straightened up, its whispers fading into silence. It lingered for a moment longer, as though deciding something, before retreating back into the corner. The paralysis lifted, and I bolted upright, gasping for air. The room was empty. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, too afraid that the shadow would return. I tried to tell myself it was just a nightmare, a product of stress or exhaustion, but deep down, I knew better. Over the next few weeks, the shadow became a regular visitor. It would appear in the corner of my room, always watching, always waiting. Sometimes it stayed in the shadows, content to observe, but other times it would move closer, its whispers filling the room with an unsettling intensity. I started to dread the nights, staying awake as long as I could, but sleep always came eventually, and with it, the shadow. It was relentless, invading my dreams and haunting my waking moments. The worst part was the feeling of being watched, even during the day. One night, I decided to confront it. I left the lights on and sat in bed, waiting for it to appear. Midnight came and went, and I began to think it wouldn't show. But then, the room grew cold. The lights flickered and dimmed, and I felt the familiar weight settle over me. The shadow was there, standing in the middle of the room. This time, it didn't wait. It moved toward me, its form rippling and shifting as it approached. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body was frozen in place, as though the paralysis had already set in. The shadow stopped inches from my bed, its form towering over me. The whispers began again, louder and more insistent than before. It leaned closer, and for the first time, I could see something in the darkness, a face, or at least the suggestion of one. Its features were vague and undefined, but there was a malevolence in its presence that sent chills down my spine. It spoke, its voice low and guttural, the words incomprehensible but filled with an undeniable sense of dread. I could feel it reaching into my mind, probing, searching for something. The sensation was invasive, like it was trying to tear away pieces of my very soul. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The shadow straightened up, its form retreating into the corner once more. The room warmed, the whispers faded, and the paralysis lifted. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, or the nights that followed. I kept the lights on, stayed awake as long as I could, but the shadow always returned. Each time, it grew bolder, its presence more oppressive. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but every night, I can feel it watching, waiting in the dark. The shadows in my room no longer feel like shadows. They feel like eyes, always there, always watching. It all started when I moved into a tiny apartment on the edge of town. The building was old and crumbling, but it was all I could afford while working my part-time job and trying to get through college. The first thing I noticed when I moved in was the mirror. It was an antique piece bolted to the wall in the bedroom, its glass slightly warped and its wooden frame dark with age. I thought about taking it down, but something about it felt permanent, like it belonged there, a part of the apartment as much as the creaking floorboards or the faded wallpaper. I didn't think much of it at first, though its surface always seemed a little too reflective, like it captured more than it should. The first night, I slept like a rock, too exhausted from moving to care about the eerie feeling of the place. But the second night, I woke up at exactly 3:12 a.m. My room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside my window. I didn't know why I woke up. There wasn't a sound, no sudden jolt. I just opened my eyes, and my body froze. At first, I thought it was the darkness playing tricks on me. The mirror, which faced my bed, seemed different. Its surface wasn't reflecting the faint light in the room. It was pitch black, but in that blackness, I saw something move. I tried to sit up, to turn my head, but my body wouldn't respond. My arms and legs were heavy, completely unmovable. The weight on my chest was unbearable, like something was pressing down on me. My breathing was shallow, and the air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. The shape in the mirror grew clearer. It wasn't my reflection. It was a figure, tall and shadowy, its form impossible to define. It had no face, no eyes, yet I knew it was looking directly at me. The longer I stared, the more solid it became, as if it was stepping out of the mirror itself. My heart pounded in my chest, a rapid thudding that seemed to echo in my ears. I tried to scream, to call for help, but my throat was tight, and no sound came out. The shadow moved closer, its presence filling the room. The air grew colder with every passing second, and I could see my breath fogging in the faint light. The figure stopped at the edge of the bed. It didn't have features, yet I could feel its intent. It wasn't just standing there. It was studying me, as though deciding what to do next. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of my shallow breaths. And then, it spoke. The voice wasn't loud. It was a whisper, low and guttural, like the creaking of old wood or the rustling of dry leaves. The words didn't make sense, but they carried a weight, an ancient, malevolent power that made my skin crawl. I could feel tears streaming down my face as I fought against the invisible bonds holding me in place. The shadow leaned closer, its formless head mere inches from mine. I could feel the cold radiating from it, a chill so deep it seemed to seep into my very bones. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the shadow began to retreat. Slowly, it backed away, its form dissolving into the darkness. As it moved, the weight on my chest lifted, and I could finally move again. I sat up, gasping for air, my entire body trembling. The mirror was normal again, reflecting the dim light from the window, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, that the shadow was still there, waiting just beneath the surface. Over the next few weeks, the visits became more frequent. Every night, I would wake up at exactly 3:12 a.m., paralyzed and helpless as the shadow emerged from the mirror. Sometimes it would just stand there, watching me. Other times, it would come closer, its whispers filling the room with their eerie, incomprehensible cadence. I stopped sleeping. I left the lights on, tried to stay awake as long as possible, but it didn't matter. The shadow always came, and it was always the same. 3:12 a.m., the weight, the cold, the whispers. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I covered the mirror with a blanket, hoping that would be enough to stop it. But when I woke up, the blanket was gone, neatly folded on the floor. The mirror was uncovered, its surface darker than ever, and the shadow was there, waiting. It started to follow me during the day. At first, it was just a feeling, an uneasy sensation of being watched. But then I began to see it in my peripheral vision, a dark shape lingering just out of sight. I'd catch glimpses of it in reflective surfaces, windows, puddles, even the screen of my phone. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was just sleep-deprived and paranoid. But deep down, I knew it was real. It was always there, watching, waiting. One night, I woke up to find the shadow closer than ever. It wasn't just standing at the foot of my bed. It was sitting on my chest, its weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. Its whispers were louder this time, more insistent. I could feel its presence, cold and invasive, like it was trying to pull me into the mirror with it. I don't know how I broke free that night, but I did. I ran from the apartment, barefoot and shaking, not caring where I went as long as it was away from that place. I stayed with a friend for a few days, too afraid to go back. Eventually, I worked up the courage to return, but only to pack my things. I couldn't stay there, not with the shadow still lurking in the mirror. I don't know what it was or why it chose me. I don't even know if it's truly gone. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake up at 3:12 a.m., and for a moment, I feel that familiar weight on my chest. I avoid mirrors now, especially old ones, because once you see the shadow, it never really leaves. It's always there, just waiting for the right moment to step through. When my parents decided to move to the countryside, I wasn't thrilled. The idea of leaving behind my friends, the city's noise, and everything familiar felt like a punishment. The house they picked was old and isolated, sitting at the end of a long, winding dirt road. It had charm, my mom said, with its creaky wooden floors and sprawling fields. To me, it just felt lonely. My room was on the second floor, and it had a single window that overlooked the backyard, which stretched into the woods. The first time I walked in, I noticed the closet door. It was slightly ajar, like someone had left it open in a hurry. I thought nothing of it at the time and shoved it closed with a firm push, the old wood groaning in protest. That night, I woke up feeling strange. The room was quiet, almost too quiet, as though the house itself was holding its breath. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and that's when I saw it. The closet door was open again, just a crack, the darkness inside seeming to pulse like it was alive. I told myself it was the draft. The house was old, and doors didn't always stay shut. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My heart raced as I stared at the narrow slit of darkness, imagining all the things that could be lurking just out of sight. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell back asleep. But the next morning, I felt uneasy. I checked the closet, yanked it open to prove to myself that nothing was there. Just old shelves and some forgotten cobwebs. I even left it open during the day, hoping that would stop whatever was happening at night. But the following night was worse. I woke up again, this time to a strange sound, a faint scratching, like nails on wood. My heart pounded as I turned my head toward the closet. The door was open wider now, wide enough that I could see the inside clearly. Only, it wasn't just shelves anymore. The darkness seemed to stretch back farther than it should, like the closet was deeper than it had been during the day. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a shadow darker than the surrounding darkness. It moved slightly, just enough to let me know it was watching me. My body froze. I tried to move, to reach for my phone, to scream, but nothing worked. It felt like an invisible force was holding me down, pinning me to the bed. The shadow stepped forward, and I could see it more clearly now. It was tall and thin, its form indistinct, like smoke trying to hold a shape. It had no eyes, no features, but I could feel it staring at me. The air in the room grew colder, and I struggled to breathe as the weight on my chest pressed down harder. The shadow didn't move closer, but its presence was overwhelming. It was as though it was reaching out to me, its intentions unclear but undeniably threatening. I tried to close my eyes, to block it out, but I couldn't. I was trapped, forced to watch as it lingered there, just inside the doorway. Eventually, the paralysis lifted, and I gasped for air, bolting upright in bed. The shadow was gone, and the closet door was shut again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, too afraid of what I might see if I closed my eyes. The days that followed were a blur. I started keeping the closet door shut and even stacked heavy boxes in front of it, hoping to keep it from opening. But it didn't help. Every night, I woke up to the sound of scratching, and every night, the door was open again. The shadow grew bolder. It began to step out of the closet, its form rippling and shifting as it moved. It never came closer than the foot of my bed, but its presence was unbearable. The whispers started soon after, low and guttural, like a voice speaking a language I couldn't understand. I tried to tell my parents, but they didn't believe me. They said it was just a bad dream, that the stress of moving was getting to me. But I knew better. The shadow was real, and it wasn't just in my head. One night, I decided to confront it. I stayed awake, sitting up in bed with a flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. Midnight came and went, and for a while, I thought maybe it wouldn't show. But then the air grew cold, and the scratching began. I shone the flashlight at the closet, but it didn't help. The beam of light seemed to dissolve into the darkness, unable to pierce it. The door creaked open, and the shadow stepped out, its form more solid than ever. It didn't stop at the foot of the bed this time. It came closer, the whispers growing louder with every step. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow loomed over me, its presence suffocating. I could feel it reaching out, its cold, intangible touch brushing against my skin. The whispers filled my ears, and for a moment, I thought I understood them. It wasn't just speaking, it was demanding something, something I couldn't give. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it retreated. The room warmed, the whispers faded, and the paralysis lifted. But I knew it wasn't over. The shadow wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. The next morning, I begged my parents to let me sleep on the couch downstairs. They finally agreed, though they still thought I was overreacting. I haven't been back in that room since. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the scratching coming from upstairs. It's faint, almost inaudible, but I know it's there. The shadow hasn't left. It's still in the closet, waiting for the right moment to come out again. The house was supposed to be a fresh start. After my parents' divorce, my mom thought moving to a small, quiet town would help us heal. The place we moved into was a little rundown, but it had charm, or so my mom said. It was a 2-story house with a wraparound porch and a backyard that sloped into a dense forest. At first, I hated it. It was too quiet, too isolated. But after a while, I convinced myself it wasn't so bad. At least, that's what I thought at first. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, and my window faced the backyard. I liked watching the forest during the day. It felt peaceful, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees and cast shifting patterns on the ground. At night, though, it was different. The woods turned into a wall of shadows, and the stillness became oppressive. The first time I noticed something was off, it was just after midnight. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I felt it, a strange sensation, like someone was watching me. My room was dark, but the faint glow from my phone illuminated just enough for me to see the outline of my furniture. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I glanced toward the window, and my breath caught in my throat. There was a figure standing outside, just beyond the glass. It was tall and dark, its outline barely distinguishable against the night. I couldn't see any details, but I knew it was looking at me. I froze, my phone slipping from my hands onto the bed. My first thought was to scream, to call for my mom, but something about the figure stopped me. It wasn't moving, but it felt wrong, like it wasn't entirely human. I blinked, and it was gone. Just like that, the space outside my window was empty, as though nothing had ever been there. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the light or my tired mind playing games with me. Still, I kept the curtains closed after that. For a few days, nothing happened. I started to believe I'd been overreacting. But then one night, I woke up suddenly, my body heavy and unresponsive. The room was pitch black, the kind of darkness that made it impossible to tell if your eyes were open or closed. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My arms and legs felt like they were pinned to the bed, an invisible weight pressing down on me. That's when I noticed the window. The curtains were open, even though I was sure I had closed them before going to bed. And outside, in the shadows of the backyard, the figure was there again. This time, it was closer. The figure wasn't just standing outside anymore. It was leaning toward the window, its form unnaturally tall and thin. It pressed a hand against the glass, the outline of its fingers sharp and distinct even in the darkness. I wanted to scream, to thrash, to do anything to break free from the paralysis, but my body refused to respond. The figure didn't move for what felt like an eternity. It just stood there, its faceless gaze fixed on me. The room grew colder, and a faint sound filled the air. A low, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against glass. Finally, the paralysis lifted, and I bolted upright, gasping for air. My chest felt tight, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I turned on the light, my eyes darting to the window. The curtains were still open, but the figure was gone. I barely slept for the rest of the night, too afraid to close my eyes. The next morning, I told my mom about what I'd seen, but she brushed it off. "It's probably just a bad dream," she said, her tone dismissive. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew it wasn't a dream. The figure started to appear more frequently after that. Every few nights, I would wake up to find it standing outside my window, closer each time. Its presence was suffocating, the air in my room growing colder and heavier whenever it appeared. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and I began to dread the nights. One evening, I decided to stay up and watch. I left the light off and sat by the window, determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head. Midnight came and went, and for a while, nothing happened. But then the backyard seemed to shift, the shadows pooling together in a way that wasn't natural. The figure emerged slowly, its form solidifying out of the darkness. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding across the grass without making a sound. My breath caught as it stopped in front of the window, its featureless face tilted slightly, as if studying me. I don't know how long we stared at each other. Time felt frozen, the world outside my room fading into nothingness. The figure raised a hand and pressed it against the glass, the tapping starting again. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It was low and guttural, like the rumble of distant thunder. The words were incomprehensible, a language I couldn't understand, but they resonated in my chest, filling me with a deep, primal fear. I don't remember how that night ended. I must have fallen asleep, though I don't know how. When I woke up, the curtains were drawn, and the figure was gone. But the sense of dread lingered, an invisible weight that followed me throughout the day. Over the next few weeks, the figure grew bolder. It started appearing inside my room, standing in the corner or at the foot of my bed. I would wake up paralyzed, unable to move or scream, as it loomed over me. Its whispers filled the air, harsh and guttural, the words burrowing into my mind like a sickness. I tried everything to get rid of it. I kept the lights on, burned sage, even tried sleeping in the living room. But no matter where I went, the figure followed. It was always there, watching, waiting. The last time I saw it, I woke up to find it standing right beside my bed. Its form was more defined now, almost human but not quite. The tapping was gone, replaced by a low, humming sound that vibrated through my bones. The figure leaned down, its faceless head inches from mine. I don't know what it wanted, but I could feel its intent. It wasn't just watching me, it was claiming me. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that threatened to drown me. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, it was morning. The figure was gone, but the sense of dread remained. I don't sleep much anymore, too afraid of what might happen if I do. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the tapping again, faint but unmistakable. I've started to notice things in the corners of my vision, shadows that shift when they shouldn't, dark shapes that vanish when I turn to look. The figure hasn't appeared again, but I know it's still there, watching me from the darkness, waiting. When we moved into the old house, I didn't think much of it. My parents were thrilled about the character of the place. Its creaky wooden floors, ornate moldings, and towering ceilings. I, however, was less impressed. It felt too big, too empty, and there was something about it that unsettled me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. My room was at the far end of the hall, separated from the rest of the bedrooms. At first, I thought it was kind of cool to have my own little corner of the house, but the isolation quickly started to bother me. The hallway was long and dimly lit, and at night, it seemed to stretch endlessly into shadow. The strange occurrences began almost immediately. The first night I spent in my new room, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were there. At first, I thought it was my parents or maybe my younger brother wandering around. But when I got up to check, the house was silent. A few nights later, the footsteps returned, louder this time. They started at the far end of the hall and grew closer, stopping just outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for the door to open, but nothing happened. After a few tense moments, I mustered the courage to peek into the hallway. It was empty. The following night, I woke up to find my door slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it before going to bed. The air in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the house settling or a draft from one of the windows. But deep down, I knew better. Things escalated after that. One night, I woke up unable to move. My eyes darted around the room, but my body felt like it was pinned to the bed. The air was icy cold, and a strange humming sound filled the room, low and droning, like a distant engine. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it was something else entirely. A figure stood at the foot of my bed, tall and dark, its form indistinct but unmistakably human. I wanted to scream, to thrash, to do anything to break free from the paralysis, but I couldn't. My breath came in shallow gasps as the figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming. It leaned over me, and though it had no face, I could feel it staring at me, its gaze penetrating and cold. The figure didn't touch me, but its presence was suffocating. It lingered for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, the paralysis lifted, and I bolted upright, gasping for air. The figure was gone, and the room was silent again. But the memory of its presence lingered, etched into my mind like a scar. I started sleeping with the lights on after that, but it didn't help. The figure continued to appear, always at the foot of my bed, always watching. It never spoke, never moved closer than a few feet, but its presence was enough to drive me to the edge of my sanity. One night, I decided to confront it. I stayed awake, clutching a flashlight, determined to prove to myself that it was just a figment of my imagination. Midnight came and went, and for a while, nothing happened. But then, just as I started to relax, The room grew cold, and the humming sound returned. The figure emerged from the corner of the room, its form shifting and rippling like smoke. I turned on the flashlight, but the beam seemed to pass right through it, as though it wasn't entirely there. The figure didn't react to the light. It simply stood there, its faceless gaze fixed on me. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed toward the door. The gesture was deliberate, almost commanding, and it filled me with a sense of dread I couldn't explain. I didn't move, paralyzed by fear. The figure lowered its hand and began to fade, its form dissolving into the shadows. The room warmed again, and the humming sound disappeared, but the sense of unease remained. I barely slept after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I expected to see the figure standing over me, its faceless form looming in the darkness. I started noticing other strange things around the house. Doors opening and closing on their own, lights flickering, and whispers coming from empty rooms. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange about the hallway. At the far end, where the shadows were darkest, there was a door I hadn't seen before. It was small and unremarkable, blending into the wall so seamlessly that it was easy to miss. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. The door creaked loudly as I opened it, revealing a narrow staircase that led up to the attic. The air was cold and stale, and a faint, musty smell wafted down. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart pounding with each step. The attic was empty, save for a few old boxes and a broken chair. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a small, dusty mirror leaning against the wall. I approached it cautiously, my reflection distorted in the cracked glass. As I stared at it, a chill ran down my spine. My reflection was wrong. It was me, but the expression was different, darker, more menacing. And then, without warning, the reflection moved. It raised a hand and pointed toward the corner of the attic. My blood ran cold as I turned to look. The figure was there, its form more solid than ever. It stepped toward me, its movements deliberate and unnaturally smooth. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and bolted down the stairs. I slammed the attic door shut and didn't stop running until I was back in my room. The figure didn't follow me, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was still in the house, watching, waiting. I begged my mom to move, to leave the house behind, but she wouldn't listen. She said it was just my imagination, that I needed to stop scaring myself. But I knew the truth. The figure wasn't just in my head. It was real, and it wasn't going anywhere. It started the week after I moved into my college dorm. Everything about the transition was overwhelming. New people, new routines, and a small, cramped room that felt nothing like home. My roommate, Kayla, was friendly enough, but she spent most nights out, leaving me alone in the room. At first, I didn't mind the solitude. It gave me time to catch up on reading and decompress from the chaos of the day. One night, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I felt it. A strange, prickling sensation crept up my spine, as though someone was standing behind me, watching. I glanced toward the door, but it was shut tight, and the room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Shaking off the feeling, I turned off my phone and tried to sleep. The sensation didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. My skin crawled, and I found myself glancing at the shadows in the corners of the room. Something felt wrong, though I couldn't say what. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it wasn't restful. I woke up multiple times during the night, heart pounding, as though I'd been running from something in my dreams. The next night was worse. I woke up around 2 a.m., my body heavy and unresponsive. My chest felt tight, as if an invisible weight was pressing down on me, and my breathing came in short, shallow gasps. The room was dark, but the dim light from the street lamp outside cast faint shadows on the walls. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, near Kayla's empty bed, a figure stood motionless. At first, I thought it was a coat or a shadow cast by the furniture, but the longer I stared, the more distinct it became. It was tall and dark, its shape vaguely human but wrong somehow, its proportions slightly off, its limbs too long. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body wouldn't move, no matter how much I willed it to. All I could do was lie there, helpless, as the figure slowly turned its head toward me. It didn't have a face, just a blank, featureless surface where its eyes and mouth should have been. The figure didn't move closer, but its presence was suffocating. My heart raced, and tears pricked my eyes as I struggled against the paralysis. The room felt colder, the air heavy and oppressive. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it was over. I sat up, gasping for breath, and looked around the room. The figure was gone, and everything seemed normal again. But I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't a dream or a hallucination. It was real. The next morning, I told Kayla about what had happened. She laughed it off, saying it was probably just a nightmare brought on by stress. I wanted to believe her, but the memory of the figure was too vivid to dismiss. Over the next few weeks, the figure became a recurring presence. It didn't appear every night, but when it did, the experience was always the same. I would wake up paralyzed, unable to move or speak, and it would be there, standing in the corner or at the foot of my bed, its faceless gaze fixed on me. I started to dread going to sleep, terrified of waking up to find the figure watching me again. I tried everything to stop it, leaving the lights on, playing music, even sleeping with a Bible under my pillow. Nothing worked. One night, I decided to stay awake and see if I could catch the figure before it appeared. I kept the lights on and propped myself up in bed with a book, my eyes darting nervously to the corners of the room. Midnight came and went, and for a while, it seemed like nothing would happen. But then, around 3 a.m., the lights flickered. The room grew colder, and the familiar sense of dread settled over me. I looked up from my book, and there it was. The figure stood in the doorway this time, its form darker and more solid than before. It didn't move, but its presence filled the room, making it hard to breathe. I gripped the edge of my blanket, my hands trembling, as the figure slowly raised an arm and pointed toward me. A low, guttural sound filled the room, like a distant rumble of thunder. It wasn't words, exactly, but I could feel the meaning behind it. The figure was warning me, though I didn't know what it wanted or why it was there. I closed my eyes, praying silently for it to go away. When I opened them again, the figure was gone, and the room was silent once more. The next day, I decided to do some research. I spent hours online, reading about sleep paralysis and shadow figures. Most of the articles dismissed the phenomenon as a natural occurrence, a trick of the brain during REM sleep. But there were other stories, ones that felt eerily similar to my own. People described shadowy beings that watched them, followed them, even tried to communicate with them. I stumbled across a forum where people shared their experiences with sleep paralysis. One post caught my attention. The person described a figure that matched the one I'd seen, a tall, faceless shadow that seemed to radiate malice. They called it the Watcher. The name sent a chill down my spine. I didn't want to believe it, but the similarities were too striking to ignore. That night, I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion got the better of me. I fell asleep with the lights on, clutching my phone like a lifeline. I woke up to find the figure standing beside my bed. This time, it was closer than ever, its form towering over me. The humming sound filled the room, louder and more intense than before, and the air was so cold I could see my breath. The figure leaned down, its blank face mere inches from mine. I could feel its presence pressing against me, an overwhelming force that made my chest ache. It didn't speak, but I could sense its intent. It wasn't just watching me anymore. It was trying to take something from me, though I couldn't say what. I fought against the paralysis with everything I had, and finally, I managed to move. I swung my arm wildly, as if trying to hit the figure, but my hand passed through empty air. The figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving me gasping for breath and trembling. I haven't seen the Watcher since that night, but the fear hasn't gone away. I still wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, convinced that it's standing just out of sight. Sometimes, I catch glimpses of it in my peripheral vision, a dark shape that vanishes the moment I turn to look. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but I can feel its presence lingering, waiting, and I know that one day, it will come back. When I was 17, my parents bought an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of house you see in movies, with peeling white paint, a creaky porch, and more rooms than a family of four could ever need. My mom fell in love with its rustic charm, and my dad was excited about the sprawling backyard. I wasn't thrilled about moving, but I didn't have much of a choice. My room was on the second floor, down a narrow hallway that always seemed a little too dark, even during the day. It had a small window that overlooked the backyard and a tall, antique mirror propped against the far wall. The mirror was a part of the house when we moved in, and my mom decided it gave the room character. I thought it was creepy, but I didn't say anything. The first night in the new house, I woke up feeling uneasy. My room was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock on the dresser, but something felt off. The air was heavy, and I had the distinct feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the room, my eyes lingering on the mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, something shifting in the reflection, but when I blinked, it was gone. I chalked it up to nerves and tried to go back to sleep, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was subtle, like an itch at the back of my mind, but it kept me on edge. Over the next few weeks, the uneasiness grew. I started having strange dreams, dark, disjointed images of shadows moving through my room, their forms twisting and writhing. In every dream, the mirror was there, reflecting the shadows even when there was nothing in front of it. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was my parents or my little brother, but the house was silent. The whispers were faint, almost too quiet to make out, but they seemed to be coming from the mirror. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The mirror's surface looked normal, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it at the mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadowy figure in the glass, but when I looked closer, it was gone. That was the first time I felt the paralysis. It happened a few nights later. I woke up in the middle of the night, unable to move. My eyes were open, and I could see the room around me, but my body wouldn't respond. The air was freezing, and the whispering had returned, louder and more insistent this time. My eyes darted to the mirror, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood in the reflection, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows around it. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs that didn't seem quite human. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unrelenting. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything to break free, but I couldn't. The paralysis held me in place, and all I could do was stare at the figure in the mirror as it stared back. After what felt like an eternity, the paralysis lifted. I bolted out of bed, turned on every light in the room, and covered the mirror with a blanket. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor, too afraid to sleep. The next morning, I told my mom about what had happened. She laughed it off, saying it was probably just a nightmare. But I knew it wasn't. It had been too real. The cold, the whispers, the figure in the mirror. Things only got worse from there. The whispers became a nightly occurrence, and the figure in the mirror appeared more often. Sometimes it would just stand there, watching me. Other times, it would move, its shadowy form shifting unnaturally. One night, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed the mirror and dragged it out of my room, down the stairs, and into the garage. I felt a sense of relief as soon as it was out of the house, but it didn't last long. That night, I woke up to find the figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was no longer confined to the mirror. Its form was more distinct now, its limbs impossibly long, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I was paralyzed again, unable to move or make a sound. The figure leaned closer, its presence overwhelming. I could feel a cold breath against my face, though it didn't have a mouth. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The figure reached out, its hand hovering just above my chest. I thought I was going to die, that it was going to pull the life out of me, but then it stopped. The figure straightened and slowly backed away, fading into the shadows. The paralysis lifted, and I sat up, gasping for air. The room was silent again, but I knew it wasn't over. I begged my parents to let me move to a different room, but they wouldn't listen. My mom said I was being dramatic, and my dad insisted there was no such thing as ghosts. I was on my own. I started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. The figure continued to appear, and the paralysis grew more frequent. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but I didn't know what else to do. One night, in a fit of desperation, I decided to confront it. I stayed awake, clutching a flashlight, and waited for the figure to appear. Midnight came and went, and for a while, nothing happened. But then, around 3 a.m., the room grew cold, and the whispers returned. The figure materialized in the corner of the room, its form darker and more solid than ever. I turned on the flashlight and shone it directly at the figure, but the beam seemed to pass right through it. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed toward the garage. I didn't understand at first, but then it hit me. The mirror. It wanted the mirror. I don't know why I did it, but I grabbed my phone and stumbled down to the garage. The mirror was still there, leaning against the wall. I hesitated for a moment, then picked it up and carried it outside. I placed the mirror on the curb and went back inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I slept without interruption for the first time in weeks. The figure hasn't appeared since, but I still feel its presence sometimes, lingering in the shadows. I don't know what it was or why it was tied to the mirror, but I'm just glad it's gone. At least, I hope it is. It all began during my sophomore year in college when I moved into an off-campus apartment with my best friend, Rachel. The place was small but cozy, with a narrow hallway that led to the bedrooms and a tiny kitchen that always smelled faintly of cinnamon, thanks to the previous tenants. We were excited to finally have a space to ourselves, away from the chaos of dorm life. The first couple of weeks were uneventful. We spent most of our time unpacking, decorating, and getting settled in. It wasn't until I started sleeping in my room that I noticed something strange. The room had a peculiar energy, an almost oppressive feeling that made the air feel heavier than it should. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination. After all, moving into a new place can feel unsettling, especially when you're used to the constant noise and activity of a dorm. But as the days went on, the feeling only grew stronger. It was most noticeable at night when I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. I would hear faint noises, soft creaks, like footsteps in the hallway, and whispers that seemed to come from the far corner of my room. The whispers were so faint that I couldn't make out the words, but they sent a chill down my spine every time I heard them. I told myself it was just the wind or the sounds of the old building settling, but deep down, I wasn't convinced. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. with a strange sensation. My body felt heavy, as if an invisible weight was pressing down on me, and I couldn't move. My eyes were open, but I couldn't turn my head or lift my arms. It was like I was trapped in my own body. That's when I saw it. In the corner of my room, just beyond the reach of the moonlight streaming through the window, stood a shadowy figure. It was tall and thin, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. Its head was tilted slightly, as if it were watching me. I wanted to scream, to call out for Rachel, but no sound came out. My heart pounded in my chest, and tears streamed down my face as I struggled against the paralysis. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, the paralysis lifted, and I could move again. I bolted upright in bed, gasping for air, and flicked on the bedside lamp. The corner of the room was empty, but the oppressive feeling lingered. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told Rachel about what had happened. She listened intently, her brow furrowed. "Do you think it was sleep paralysis?" she asked. "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. I had read about sleep paralysis before, but this felt different. It felt real. Over the next few weeks, the occurrences became more frequent. I would wake up paralyzed, the shadowy figure standing in the corner of my room. Sometimes it was closer, its form darker and more defined. Other times, I could hear the whispers more clearly, though the words were still unintelligible. I started to dread going to bed. I stayed up late, scrolling through my phone or watching TV, hoping to exhaust myself to the point where I wouldn't wake up in the middle of the night. But it didn't work. The figure always appeared, no matter how tired I was. One night, I decided to confront it. I stayed awake, sitting on my bed with the lights on, clutching a flashlight. Midnight came and went, and for a while, nothing happened. I began to think that maybe it wouldn't show up if I was awake. But then, around 3 a.m., the room grew cold. The whispers started, faint at first, then louder and more insistent. My hands trembled as I shone the flashlight toward the corner of the room. The figure was there. It didn't flinch or move, even as the beam of light passed over it. Its form seemed to absorb the light, making it appear even darker. My breath caught in my throat as the whispers grew louder, filling the room with an eerie, otherworldly hum. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond, but the whispers seemed to shift, almost as if they were laughing. Then, slowly, the figure raised an arm and pointed toward the door. I felt a surge of fear, but also a strange compulsion to follow. My legs moved on their own, carrying me out of the room and down the hallway. The whispers followed me, growing louder with each step. I stopped in front of the closet at the end of the hallway. The whispers were deafening now, a chaotic chorus of voices urging me to open the door. My hand reached for the handle, trembling as I turned it. Inside the closet, there was nothing but darkness. It was impossibly deep, as if the space extended far beyond the physical dimensions of the apartment. The air inside was freezing, and the oppressive feeling was stronger than ever. Suddenly, a hand reached out from the darkness, its fingers long and claw-like. I stumbled back, slamming the closet door shut, and ran back to my room. The figure was gone when I returned, but the whispers lingered, faint and mocking. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and when the sun finally rose, I packed a bag and left. I moved back into the dorms a week later. Rachel stayed in the apartment, insisting that she didn't feel anything unusual. I tried to explain what had happened, but she just looked at me like I was crazy. I haven't been back to the apartment since, but sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear the whispers. They're faint, just barely audible, but they're there. And sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I see the shadowy figure, watching me from the darkness. When I was 19, I moved into my first apartment. It was small, but it felt like freedom. I had a bedroom with a huge window that overlooked the city, a cozy living room, and a kitchen that I couldn't wait to cook in. It was my own space, and I was proud of it. However, something about that apartment felt wrong from the very first night. At first, it was just little things. The apartment was old, and I chalked up the odd creaks and groans of the building to its age. The lights flickered sometimes, and the floors seemed to sigh under my feet, but I didn't think too much about it. It was a cheap place to rent, so I told myself I shouldn't expect perfection. The trouble started a few nights after I'd settled in. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling as though I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, and I was paralyzed. My eyes were wide open, but I couldn't move a muscle. It felt like something heavy was sitting on top of me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Panic set in. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, but still, I couldn't move, couldn't break free from the suffocating feeling. It wasn't until the paralysis lifted that I could finally breathe again, gasping for air like I had just surfaced from underwater. The room was dark, but everything seemed normal. My apartment was quiet, with only the hum of the fridge in the corner. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me and forced myself back to sleep. I assumed it was just a bad dream, maybe a result of stress. The next night, it happened again. I woke up in the middle of the night, only this time, I wasn't alone. There, standing at the foot of my bed, was a dark figure. It was tall, its body outlined against the dark hallway light coming from outside my room. The figure wasn't solid, like a person. It was more like a shadow, a shape that didn't belong. It stood perfectly still, just watching me. Its features were obscured, and it gave off the sense that it wasn't human. I couldn't move. The same suffocating weight pressed on my chest, and I struggled against the paralysis. My eyes locked on the figure, and it felt like it was staring right through me. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, made my skin crawl. The figure didn't move, but the air felt thick and cold. as if something was drawing all the warmth from the room. I don't know how long I lay there, unable to move, unable to blink. My thoughts raced, trying to figure out if I was dreaming, if this was some sort of hallucination, but the terror was too real to be just a bad dream. And then, just as I thought I might suffocate from the fear, the figure slowly moved toward the door. As soon as it stepped out of the room, the paralysis lifted, and I sat up, gasping for air. The room was silent, but I felt it. The lingering presence of the figure, still in the apartment, somewhere just beyond the door. My heart pounded, and I sat frozen in place, too scared to move. The fear kept me wide awake for the rest of the night. The next day, I tried to tell myself that I was just stressed, that maybe I had been too tired, or maybe the darkness played tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. There was something in that apartment, something I couldn't see but could feel. I tried to go about my day, but the unease never left. Night after night, the figure returned. It never came close enough to touch me, but it always stood at the foot of my bed, always just watching. I could feel its eyes on me, though it had no face. Every time, the paralysis hit harder, and I couldn't move, couldn't escape. The whispers started too, soft at first, like a distant murmur. But as the days went on, they grew louder, filling the silence of the room until I couldn't distinguish one voice from another. The figure never spoke, but I could hear the whispers, as though they were coming from it, or from somewhere near it. They sounded like whispers in a language I didn't understand, a chorus of voices that made my blood run cold. It was around this time that I started to notice something else. The hallway. The figure didn't just appear in my room. It was always positioned just outside, standing at the end of the hall. No matter how many times I woke up, it was always there, at the threshold of my room, watching, waiting. I don't know when I started to fear the hallway more than the figure itself. The hallway became a place of dread, a dark, hollow space that I could never escape. I would hear the faintest creaks, the sound of footsteps that echoed in the silence, and sometimes I could feel the presence just beyond the corner. It was like the hallway was alive with the figure's energy, and I couldn't get away from it. Desperate to get rid of whatever was haunting me, I started researching. I scoured the internet for stories of shadow figures, of sleep paralysis, of haunted places. I discovered that shadow figures were a common part of sleep paralysis episodes, and I read about how people often reported seeing them at the edge of their beds or in doorways. But none of the stories mentioned the whispers, the feeling that the figure was watching me day and night, or the sense of it lurking in the hallway. I had to find a way to end it. I began to take extreme measures. I tried to sleep with the lights on, but the figure would still appear, sometimes darker, sometimes even clearer, as if the light itself couldn't dispel it. I tried praying, though I didn't consider myself particularly religious. I thought maybe it would help, but the figure only grew stronger, and the paralysis grew more frequent. The whispers intensified too, becoming almost maddening. One night, I had enough. I decided to confront it. I waited until the figure appeared again at the foot of my bed, as it always did. This time, I refused to let the paralysis take hold. I focused all my energy on moving, on fighting the suffocating weight of fear. The whispers began to crescendo in my ears, but I didn't care. I needed to confront it. With everything I had left, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. I aimed it directly at the figure, watching as the light cut through the darkness, illuminating the shadow. But instead of fading away, the figure just stood there, unmoved. It was as if the light didn't affect it at all. Then, something strange happened. The whispers grew louder, turning into words, though they were still hard to understand. I could hear them repeating over and over, like a chant. It's always watching. It's always here. Suddenly, the figure started to move toward me, its form stretching and distorting as it came closer, until it was looming directly over me. I could feel its cold presence as if it was touching me, though it wasn't physically there. The whispers became deafening, and I thought my mind might snap under the pressure. In a final act of desperation, I screamed. The sound that came from me was raw, filled with the terror that had built up inside me for weeks. The figure froze, its form flickering like a malfunctioning TV screen. For a moment, everything went silent. and then it was gone. I don't know how, but the figure vanished. The weight lifted from my chest, the whispers faded, and the oppressive feeling in the room disappeared. I was free. I moved out of the apartment the very next day. I never went back. I don't know what it was that haunted that place. The shadow, the whispers, the paralysis, but I know I'm not going to find out. Some things are better left unexplored. It all started one night when I was staying at my grandparents' house. I had always loved visiting them because of the peace and calm that seemed to surround their rural home. It was a two-story house, built long before I was born, with old wooden floors that creaked underfoot and antique furniture that seemed to hold memories of generations gone by. My grandparents always made sure I had a cozy room to stay in whenever I visited, which was usually a quiet and relaxing escape from my busy life. But that night, everything changed. It was late, and I was lying in bed, trying to drift off to sleep. My room was at the end of a long hallway, and the only light came from the dim glow of the moon through the curtains. The silence in the house was comforting, but something about it felt off. My mind was restless, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I told myself I was being silly, that I was just imagining things, but I couldn't ignore the unease settling in my chest. I turned over, pulling the covers tighter around me, trying to force myself to sleep. It wasn't long before I began to drift off, but then a strange sensation washed over me. It started with a heavy pressure on my chest, as though something was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. My body felt incredibly heavy, and no matter how hard I tried to move, I couldn't. It was like my limbs were made of lead. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight, and no sound came out. I was paralyzed. My eyes were wide open, but I couldn't move a muscle. I was fully aware of everything around me, yet trapped in my own body. I tried to turn my head to look around the room, but it felt like my neck was frozen in place. The silence in the room seemed deafening, but the pressure on my chest made everything feel muffled, as though I were underwater. Then, I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, in the darkness of the room, I saw a figure standing near the doorway. At first, it was just a shadow, barely distinguishable from the blackness of the hallway. But as my eyes focused on it, I saw it more clearly. A tall, thin figure, entirely black, its shape blending into the darkness as if it were one with the shadows. Its presence was chilling, and I felt a deep, primal fear surge through me. I knew it wasn't human. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, its dark form barely perceptible except for its outline. I tried to scream again, to call out for help, but my mouth refused to cooperate. All I could do was lie there, paralyzed and helpless, with the dark figure watching me in the silence of the room. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, and my mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but I was powerless. I wanted to close my eyes, to block out the sight of the figure, but I couldn't. It felt as though my very soul was being drawn to it, as if I couldn't look away, even if I wanted to. Then, the figure began to move. Slowly, it took a step forward. I watched in horror as it glided across the room, its movement smooth and unnerving, as if it wasn't even touching the floor. With each step it took, my fear intensified, and the pressure on my chest grew heavier. The whispers started then, faint at first, like a soft murmur just beyond my hearing. But they grew louder with each passing second, until the room was filled with a low, almost imperceptible hum. It was as if the whispers were coming from the figure itself. As the figure neared my bed, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't even close my eyes. The figure reached the edge of my bed, and I could feel its presence so close to me, almost as if it were touching me, but it never did. It just stood there, watching me. The whispers became clearer now, though I still couldn't understand the words. They were a mix of soft and guttural sounds, as though spoken in a language that wasn't meant for human ears. I tried to focus, to make sense of what was happening, but I couldn't. My heart pounded in my chest, and tears began to fill my eyes, blurring my vision. All I could do was lie there, frozen in terror, as the figure loomed over me. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes, but it seemed like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure moved back toward the door. I felt the pressure on my chest slowly lift, and I was able to take a deep breath, but I didn't dare to move. I stayed perfectly still, eyes wide, waiting for the figure to return. It didn't. Instead, the whispers faded, and the room fell into an eerie silence once again. I lay there for what felt like hours, unable to shake the feeling that the figure was still watching me from the shadows, just waiting for the moment to return. Eventually, I was able to move my body again. I bolted upright in bed, gasping for air. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and I could feel the cold sweat on my skin. I turned on the bedside lamp, casting light into the room, but the figure was gone. The room looked exactly as it had before, peaceful and normal, but I knew what I had seen. I sat there in bed, trembling, unsure of what to do next. Was it a dream? A hallucination? I didn't know, but it felt far too real. The fear lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house, something I couldn't understand. I knew I couldn't stay in that room any longer, so I grabbed my blanket and went asleep in the living room on the couch. The next morning, I tried to shake off what had happened. I told myself it was just sleep paralysis, that it was all in my head, but deep down, I couldn't convince myself. The image of the shadowy figure haunted me, and I didn't want to go back to that room again. But I didn't tell my grandparents. I didn't want them to worry. That night, I decided to stay up late, hoping that if I stayed awake long enough, I wouldn't have to experience whatever that thing was again. I kept the lights on in the living room, and I made sure to keep the television on for noise. But as the hours passed and I began to feel drowsy, I couldn't help but notice how quiet the house had become. The silence was almost oppressive, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Around 3 a.m., I dozed off on the couch. I woke up with a start, my heart racing. I had heard something, a faint whisper, like the one from the night before. My body froze, and I quickly glanced around the room. The light from the television cast long shadows on the walls, but nothing was out of place. Then I saw it. Standing in the hallway, just at the edge of the living room, was the figure again. Its shape was darker than the shadows, and its presence felt suffocating. The whispers started again, louder this time, and I could feel the same terrifying pressure on my chest, just like the night before. My body froze, paralyzed, as the figure slowly moved closer. It was here again. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. All I could do was lie there, watching as the figure approached, its whispers growing louder, almost deafening. But just as it reached the doorway to the living room, it stopped. It turned, as if sensing my fear, and then slowly faded back into the shadows of the hallway. The pressure lifted, and I could finally move. I jumped to my feet and ran out of the house, too terrified to stay any longer. I drove straight to a friend's house, not knowing what had just happened or why. I didn't know if I would ever be able to return to my grandparents' house, or if the figure would follow me. I still don't know what it was or why it chose to visit me, but I know one thing. I'll never forget the dark figure in the hallway, and I'll never forget the whispers that followed it, like a warning that I couldn't ignore. I've always been a light sleeper. Even as a kid, I'd wake up at the slightest sound, whether it was the creak of the house settling or the wind outside. I'd stir and open my eyes, instantly alert. It wasn't unusual for me to wake up in the middle of the night, staring into the dark, listening to the silence. But over the past few months, something had started happening that I couldn't explain. Something terrifying, something that left me lying awake at night, afraid to even blink. It began with the shadows. At first, it was subtle. I would wake up in the middle of the night, only to notice that the shape of the room seemed slightly different. The corner of the room where my dresser stood would appear darker, even though I had left a light on in the hallway. I told myself it was just my imagination, the way the moonlight filtered through the curtains. But the longer I stayed awake, the more unnerving it became. It felt as though there was something in that corner, something moving, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I tried to convince myself it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. But then, one night, I woke up and saw it. The figure. It was tall, dark, and unmoving. It stood perfectly still in the corner of my room, just beyond the edge of my bed. I could make out its silhouette, sharp, unnatural, like the shadows had taken on a life of their own. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. My body felt like it was trapped, frozen in place, as if the weight of the figure was holding me down. It was like a nightmare, but I was wide awake. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it real? Was I just imagining it? I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed by fear, staring at the shadow in the corner. The longer I looked at it, the more details began to form. It wasn't just a blob of darkness. It had shape, depth, like it was a solid being standing in the room with me. I could almost make out the outline of a head, broad shoulders, and long, thin limbs. It wasn't human, but it was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. And then, it started moving. At first, it was a slight shift, a subtle change in the darkness, but as it began to move, I felt the terror grip me even harder. The figure didn't walk or shuffle like a person. It glided, slowly and silently, across the room. It moved toward me, its shape becoming more defined as it came closer, like it was aware of my fear. I couldn't look away. The pressure in my chest became unbearable, and I could feel my pulse racing. It was getting closer, and I couldn't do anything about it. As it reached the foot of my bed, the paralysis lifted, and I could finally move. I immediately sat up, gasping for air, but the figure didn't leave. It stayed there, watching me, as if it was waiting for something. I tried to turn on the light, but my hands wouldn't cooperate. I reached for my phone to call someone, but it was like my body was refusing to obey me. The fear was suffocating, and I felt like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. The figure in the corner didn't move, but the silence grew thicker, pressing in on me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see a face. It was just darkness, but I knew it was watching. And then, I heard it, a whisper, soft and barely audible, coming from the figure. "You're not alone." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I instantly froze. I didn't know what to do. The whispers continued, growing louder, but I still couldn't make out the words. It was like they were coming from everywhere at once, surrounding me, echoing through the room. I tried to move again, but I was frozen once more, paralyzed by fear. I don't know how long I stayed there, caught between fear and paralysis. But eventually, the figure started to fade, melting back into the shadows from which it had come. The whispers stopped, and the room became silent again. I lay there, my heart still racing, unable to fully process what had just happened. Was I imagining it? Had I been dreaming? I didn't know, but the terror was real. I felt it in my bones. The next few nights were worse. Each time I tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I would wake up to find the figure in the corner of my room, watching me silently. It never moved closer right away, but it was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating, even when I wasn't looking at it. And every time I tried to move, to cry out for help, the paralysis would take over again, holding me in place until the figure slowly faded back into the corner. But then, one night, something changed. I woke up, as usual, to the feeling of something watching me. I turned my head slowly, my eyes scanning the dark room. The corner where the figure usually stood was empty. For a moment, I thought maybe it was gone. Maybe I was imagining everything, and the worst was finally over. But then, as I looked at the edge of my bed, I saw it. The figure wasn't in the corner anymore. It was right there, at the foot of my bed, staring at me. The air in the room grew thick, and the pressure on my chest returned, stronger than before. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was like the figure was suffocating me, stealing the air from my lungs. The whispers started again, louder this time, rushing into my ears like a flood. "You can't escape." The voice wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, a threat. The figure began to loom over me, its presence more intense than ever. I could feel its dark energy pressing in from all sides, like it was closing in on me, inch by inch. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I was completely helpless. The figure reached out, its long, thin arm stretching toward me, and for the first time, I could feel something cold, icy fingers brushing against my skin. The touch was enough to send a shock of terror through me, and I thought I might lose my mind. In that moment, I did the only thing I could think to do. I forced myself to look away. I didn't want to see it, didn't want to feel it. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up, to break free from the nightmare. I don't know how long I lay there, eyes clenched shut, praying for it to end. When I finally opened my eyes, the figure was gone. The room was quiet again. The air felt lighter, and the pressure on my chest had lifted. I could move again, but my body felt weak, drained from the terror I had just experienced. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that the figure was still somewhere, waiting to return. From that night on, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up as late as I could, terrified that the figure would come back. I tried everything to get rid of it, leaving lights on, closing my eyes tightly, even sleeping with the covers over my head. But no matter what I did, it always came back. The figure in the corner, the whispers, the paralyzing fear. It was like it was a part of me now, a dark presence that wouldn't leave. It wasn't until I finally moved out of that house that the visits stopped. I don't know what it was, or why it had come after me, but I haven't seen it since. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still wake up, convinced that it's standing in the corner of my room, watching me. And when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers, "You can't escape." It all started one evening when I was visiting my aunt's house in the countryside. She lived in a small, isolated cottage at the edge of the woods, surrounded by tall trees and rolling hills. There was something oddly peaceful about it, yet at the same time, something unsettling. The old stone walls of the house seemed to carry the weight of decades of secrets, and the heavy curtains in each room shut out the light, leaving everything shrouded in an eerie dimness. I had just finished a long day of hiking through the nearby woods with my cousins and was exhausted. My aunt had prepared a big dinner, and after eating, we all gathered in the living room to chat and relax. My aunt's house had that old-world charm, with creaky floors and an overwhelming sense of history. But as the night wore on, I began to feel more and more out of place, as if something was watching me, lurking in the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had more to it than met the eye, but I pushed those thoughts aside and tried to enjoy my time with family. After the evening winded down, my aunt showed me to the guest bedroom where I would be sleeping for the night. The room was quaint, but had an odd coldness to it, despite the warmth of the fire in the other room. The bed was large, with a thick quilt that felt unusually heavy. I brushed aside my discomfort and laid down, thinking I'd be asleep in no time. But it didn't take long for that unsettling feeling to return. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I kept thinking I heard something. Footsteps, perhaps echoing from somewhere in the hallway. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the house settling. But the longer I lay there, the more I started to feel as though I wasn't alone. It was around 2 a.m. when it first happened. I had drifted off to sleep and awoke suddenly, not to any noise, but to the oppressive weight of fear in the air. My eyes snapped open, and I could feel my heartbeat quicken. I wasn't sure why, but I instinctively knew that something was wrong. My body felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I tried to move, but my limbs wouldn't obey. It was like I was stuck in a dream, paralyzed, unable to do anything except lie there and feel the cold sweat form on my skin. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then, through the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. It stood at the edge of my bed, tall and thin, just beyond the reach of the dim light spilling in through the window. It didn't move at first, just stood there, watching me. I could barely make out the shape, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. It was as though it was waiting for something, like it was waiting for me to notice. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but no sound would come. My chest tightened, and I could feel the cold air around me become suffocating. I tried to move, to kick my legs, to push myself up, but my body refused to cooperate. I was completely paralyzed. The shadow didn't move, but I could sense its presence. It felt as if it was somehow connected to me, as though it was feeding off my fear. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my heart pounded so loudly in my chest I thought it would burst. The shadow seemed to grow darker, more defined, like it was becoming more solid with every passing second. It was no longer just a shape in the corner of my vision. It was something real. Then, it began to move. The figure glided silently across the room, its dark form cutting through the moonlight like a blade. I could see no eyes, no face, just a tall, shifting silhouette, almost liquid in its motion. I tried to look away, to close my eyes, to pretend it wasn't there, but I couldn't. It was as if the figure was pulling my gaze toward it, as if it had control over my very will. It reached the foot of my bed, and I could feel its coldness seep into the room, filling every inch with a deep, suffocating chill. The air seemed to grow heavier, and my chest felt like it was being crushed under an invisible weight. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at the figure, frozen in place. I didn't know how much time passed, but it felt like hours. My mind screamed for me to do something, to move, to fight back, but my body wouldn't listen. I felt trapped, as if I was caught between the waking world and a nightmare. The shadow didn't make a sound, but I could feel it watching me, drawing closer, waiting for me to show weakness. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow stopped. It didn't retreat or leave. It just stood there, looming in front of me, like it was waiting. I couldn't tell if it was looking at me. It didn't have eyes, but somehow, I knew it was aware of me, aware of my terror. I was on the brink of losing my sanity, my mind swirling with 1,000 questions. What was it? Was it real? Why couldn't I move? Why was it here? But then, as if answering my thoughts, the shadow began to dissolve, like smoke slipping through the cracks of reality. It faded back into the corner of the room, slowly and quietly, until it was nothing but a memory, a fleeting, dark shape that left me breathless and trembling. When I was finally able to move again, I didn't waste any time. I bolted upright in bed, gasping for air, my heart racing in my chest. I frantically turned on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with light, but the shadow was gone. The room looked normal, nothing out of place, but I knew what I had seen. I knew what had been in that room with me. I wasn't imagining it. Shaking, I stood up and crept to the door, trying to be as quiet as possible, afraid of what might happen if I made a sound. I peeked into the hallway, but everything seemed calm, too calm. The house felt different now, like it was holding its breath, waiting. I could still feel the weight of the shadow's presence, even though it was no longer in the room with me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat by the window, too scared to even lie down. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump, my eyes darting to the corners of the room, scanning for movement. But there was nothing. The shadow was gone. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, and I didn't want to make my family worried. Besides, my aunt's house was old, and sometimes, old houses have strange sounds. I convinced myself that I had just experienced some kind of weird, vivid dream or sleep paralysis. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a dream. What I saw in that room was real, and it had been terrifying. The visits continued over the next few nights. Each time I stayed in that room, the shadow came back. It started in the corner, just out of sight, but it always moved closer, inching its way toward me, as if it was savoring my fear. I could never escape it. Each time it approached, the paralyzing terror would take over, and I'd be trapped in place, unable to move, unable to scream. It wasn't until I decided to leave that the visits stopped. I told my aunt that I needed to go home early, and though she was confused, she didn't press me. I packed my things in a hurry, not even staying to say goodbye to my cousins, and left without a second thought. I haven't been back to that house since. It's been years now, and I've tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But every now and then, when I'm lying in bed at night, I feel that same cold weight in the air. I don't know what it was that haunted that room, but I do know that I'll never forget it. The shadow, the terror, the feeling of being watched. Those things stay with you, even when the nightmare is over. I try not to think about it, but I know one thing for sure. I never want to experience that again. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still feel the shadow lurking in the corners, waiting for the right moment to come back. It began on an ordinary night, one of those quiet evenings when the world outside feels still and calm. I had just moved into my first apartment, a small, one-bedroom place on the third floor of an old building. The floors creaked, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear the muffled sounds of my neighbors, but I didn't mind. It was my space, and I was proud of it. I spent the evening unpacking boxes and setting up my living room. By the time I was done, it was past midnight, and I was exhausted. The soft hum of the city outside lulled me as I climbed into bed, hoping for a good night's rest. The bed was warm, the sheets soft, and I quickly drifted into a deep sleep. At first, the dream was pleasant, bright, colorful images swirling in my mind. But then, something changed. The light in my dream faded, replaced by a creeping darkness. A sense of unease washed over me, pulling me out of sleep like a hand gripping my shoulder. When I opened my eyes, the room was pitch black. For a moment, I couldn't figure out why I had woken up. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. That's when I realized I couldn't move. My arms and legs were pinned down, as if something heavy was pressing on my chest. Panic set in as I tried to lift even a finger, but my body refused to obey. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow at the edge of my vision. A tall, dark figure standing in the corner of my bedroom, motionless. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Maybe it was just a trick of the moonlight, or my tired mind playing games. But the longer I stared, the more real it became. The figure was impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its outline was jagged and uneven, like smoke that refused to dissipate. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. The air in the room grew heavier, colder, and I could hear a faint, low hum, like the sound of distant wind. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound came. My throat felt as if it were filled with sand, dry and constricted. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. The shadow didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, like it was draining the air from the room. Minutes passed. At least, it felt like minutes. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as I lay there, helpless. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Was this sleep paralysis? A nightmare? But it felt too real. I could feel the cold. I could hear the faint buzzing, and I could see the figure, looming in the corner like it belonged there. Then, without warning, it began to move. The figure didn't walk. It glided, its form shifting and rippling like smoke caught in a breeze. It moved toward me, slowly at first, as if testing my reaction. My chest tightened, and tears welled up in my eyes as I struggled against the invisible force holding me down. The closer it got, the more intense the humming became, a deep, bone-shaking vibration that made my teeth ache. It stopped at the foot of my bed, towering over me. The shadow seemed to grow darker, more solid, and I could feel its gaze boring into me. My body trembled, though I couldn't move. It leaned forward slightly, its shape bending unnaturally, and I swear I heard a faint whisper, so soft it could have been my imagination. "You can't hide." The words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to scream, to beg it to leave me alone, but I was trapped, my body a prison. The shadow leaned closer, its dark form almost touching me, and I felt a cold, electric sensation crawl across my skin. And then, as quickly as it had come, it vanished. The weight lifted from my chest, and I gasped for air, sitting up in bed with a jerk. The room was empty, silent except for the sound of my ragged breathing. I fumbled for the lamp on my bedside table, flooding the room with light. Nothing. No shadow, no figure, no whisper. But the cold lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to tell myself it had just been a bad dream, some mix of exhaustion and stress from moving. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I couldn't forget the feeling of the shadow's presence, the weight on my chest, or the whisper that seemed to echo in my mind. The next few nights were uneventful. I left the light on when I went to bed, and though I felt uneasy, I managed to sleep. But the sense of dread never completely left me. I would catch myself glancing at the corners of the room, half expecting to see the shadow return. And then it did. This time, it came while I was awake. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I felt it, the cold, heavy presence that had haunted me before. My hand froze, and I slowly looked up. It was there, standing in the doorway to my bedroom. The shadow was darker this time, more defined, and it seemed to pulse with energy. The air around it shimmered, like heat rising from pavement, but the room was ice cold. I couldn't look away, my body paralyzed with fear. The shadow moved closer, gliding silently across the floor. I wanted to run, to get out of the apartment, but my legs wouldn't work. The buzzing noise returned, louder this time, vibrating through my skull. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its form towering over me. "Why are you here?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. The shadow didn't respond, but I felt its presence grow heavier, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I thought I was going to pass out, the world around me spinning. And then, just as before, it vanished. I didn't stay in that apartment after that night. I packed a bag and left, staying with a friend while I figured out what to do. I didn't tell anyone the full story. I didn't want them to think I was crazy, but I couldn't go back. Even now, months later, I can still feel it sometimes. That cold, heavy presence, watching me from the corners of dark rooms. I don't know what it was or why it chose me, but I know one thing for certain. It's not gone. It's waiting, somewhere in the shadows, biding its time. And when it comes back, I don't know if I'll be able to escape it again. It started on a Sunday night, one of those quiet evenings where the only sound was the ticking of the clock on my bedroom wall. I had always been a light sleeper, but lately, sleep felt more like a battle than a comfort. Every night for the past week, I had woken up around the same time, 3:15 a.m. Like clockwork, my eyes would snap open, and a heavy, oppressive feeling would settle over me. At first, I blamed stress. College exams were around the corner, and my schedule was a mess. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just stress. There was something more, something I couldn't explain. The air in my room felt different, heavier, colder. My usually cozy space had become unsettling, like I wasn't alone. That Sunday night, I went to bed earlier than usual, hoping to catch up on sleep. I turned off the lights and crawled under my blanket, trying to push the nagging unease out of my mind. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the fan, and before long, I drifted off. I don't know how much time had passed when I woke up, but the first thing I noticed was the stillness. The fan had stopped humming, and the air felt dense and cold. My eyes fluttered open, and I immediately sensed that something was wrong. My body felt heavy, pinned to the bed as if an invisible weight was pressing down on me. I tried to move, to lift my arm or wiggle my toes, but nothing happened. Panic started to creep in as I realized I couldn't even turn my head. My breathing quickened, though it felt like the air itself was being stolen from the room. Then, in the corner of my vision, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow cast by the moonlight filtering through my blinds. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a figure, tall and slender, standing in the far corner of my room. My heart raced as I stared at it, hoping, praying, it would disappear if I blinked. But it didn't. It stood there, motionless, as if it was watching me. The figure was blacker than the shadows around it, its form blending seamlessly into the darkness. It had no discernible features, no face, no eyes, but I could feel its gaze. It was the kind of presence that made your skin crawl, the kind that made every instinct in your body scream to run. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but my voice was gone. No matter how hard I tried, no sound would come. My chest felt tight, like I was suffocating, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. The figure began to move, gliding silently across the room. It didn't walk. It floated, its movements smooth and unnatural. It stopped at the foot of my bed, looming over me. The cold in the room intensified, and I could feel a strange pressure, like the figure was drawing closer, even though it hadn't moved. I closed my eyes, hoping to shut it out, but that only made things worse. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I could still see it, its form etched into my mind. Then, I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it was barely audible. At first, I couldn't make out the words, but as the whispering continued, it grew louder, more distinct. "Do you see me?" The voice was low and rasping, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. My stomach churned, and I felt tears sting my eyes. I wanted to scream that yes, I saw it, but I was frozen, helpless. The figure leaned closer, its presence so overwhelming that I thought I might pass out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but they were no longer coming from the shadow. They were everywhere, in my ears, in my mind, surrounding me. "You can't escape," the voice hissed, and I felt a cold breath against my face. I don't know how long it lasted, but eventually, the figure began to retreat. It moved back to the corner of the room, its form melting into the shadows like smoke. The weight on my chest lifted, and I gasped for air, my lungs burning as I finally sat up. The room was silent again, the fan humming softly as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. My body trembled as I reached for the bedside lamp, flooding the room with light. The corner where the figure had stood was empty, but the cold lingered, a chilling reminder of what I had just experienced. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just sleep paralysis, a common phenomenon where your mind wakes up, but your body remains frozen in a state of sleep. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The whispers, the figure, they felt too real, too deliberate. Over the next few nights, I avoided sleeping in my room. I stayed on the couch in the living room, leaving every light on. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed darker, noises seemed louder, and I jumped at every creak and groan of the house. When I finally worked up the courage to sleep in my room again, I made sure to keep a lamp on. I told myself that light would keep the figure away, that it couldn't appear in the brightness. For a while, it seemed to work. I managed to get a few nights of uninterrupted sleep, and I started to believe that maybe it was over. But it wasn't. One night, as I lay in bed with the lamp glowing softly beside me, I felt the now familiar coldness return. My body stiffened, and my breath hitched as I realized I couldn't move. The lamp flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. And there it was. The shadow stood at the foot of my bed, more defined than ever. It didn't wait this time. It moved closer, its form stretching unnaturally as it loomed over me. The whispers returned, louder, more insistent, filling my ears with a cacophony of voices. "Do you see me?" they asked again, over and over, like a broken record. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears streaming down my face. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to hear it. I just wanted it to leave me alone. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, and the room fell silent. I opened my eyes cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was gone, but the sense of dread remained. I don't know what it was that haunted me, but I do know that it wasn't just a dream. I've moved since then, leaving that apartment behind, but I can't escape the memories. Sometimes, when I lie in bed at night, I feel the same coldness creeping in, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. And every now and then, just as I'm about to drift off to sleep, I hear the faintest whisper in the dark. It was my first night back in my childhood home after nearly a decade. My parents had passed away, and I'd inherited the house, a modest two-story tucked away in a quiet suburb. It was meant to be a place of comfort, full of memories, but instead, it felt strange. The walls seemed to breathe with a life of their own, and the creaks of the floorboards echoed louder than I remembered. I told myself it was just the nerves of being back after so many years. I had left that house at 18, eager to escape the suffocating quiet, the sense of always being watched. It wasn't until later in life that I started to understand why I had felt that way. That night, I was too exhausted from cleaning and unpacking to pay much attention to my unease. I climbed the creaky stairs to my old bedroom, now sparse and hollow without the clutter of my teenage years. The moonlight filtered through the half-closed blinds, casting long shadows across the walls. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, a scent I hadn't realized I missed until now. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to quiet my racing mind. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional groan of the house settling. Eventually, my eyelids grew heavy, and I drifted off into an uneasy sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the room was darker than it had been before. The moon had shifted, leaving the room bathed in a dim, gray light. My body felt strange, like it wasn't my own. I tried to move, to sit up, but I couldn't. It was as if invisible chains were holding me down, pressing me into the mattress. My eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, to explain what was happening. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the moonlight, stood a figure. It was tall and impossibly still, its form darker than the shadows around it. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't have a face, at least not one I could make out, but I could feel it watching me. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I tried to scream, to call out for help, but no sound came. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating, and every instinct in my body screamed for me to run. But I couldn't move. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, silent and unmoving, as if it was waiting for something. Minutes felt like hours as I lay there, frozen in fear. I wanted to close my eyes, to shut it out, but I couldn't look away. Then, slowly, it began to move. The figure didn't walk. It glided, its movements smooth and unnatural. It drifted closer to the bed, the darkness around it seeming to grow deeper. I could feel the temperature drop as it approached, the air turning icy against my skin. I struggled against the invisible weight holding me down, desperate to escape. My fingers twitched, then my hand. But it wasn't enough. The figure was at the foot of my bed now, looming over me like a shadow come to life. And then it leaned in. Its form bent unnaturally, its head tilting as if studying me. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, heavy and oppressive. My chest tightened, and my vision blurred with tears. It was so close that I thought I might be swallowed by the darkness. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually, the figure began to recede. It pulled back, retreating to the corner where it had first appeared. The weight lifted from my chest, and I gasped for air, my body trembling. When I finally managed to sit up, the room was empty. The shadows were just shadows, and the air felt normal again. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't my imagination. The next morning, I told myself it had been a nightmare, a trick of my mind adjusting to the old house. I kept busy, filling the day with errands and distractions. By the time night fell, I was exhausted, but the thought of sleeping in that room again made my stomach turn. I decided to sleep on the couch in the living room, where the light from the street lamps filtered through the curtains. It felt safer, less isolated. I fell asleep quickly, but it didn't last. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the same oppressive feeling. My body was frozen, my breath shallow. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. And then I saw it again. The figure was standing at the far end of the living room, near the doorway. It was the same as before, tall, dark, and featureless. But this time, it didn't stay still. It began to move immediately, gliding toward me with a purpose. I tried to scream, to move, but it was like my body didn't belong to me. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its form towering over the couch. I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, like it was drawing the very life out of the room. It leaned closer, and for the first time, I heard it. A faint whisper, low and guttural, filled the air. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound sent a chill down my spine. It was like a voice from another world, something ancient and incomprehensible. The figure lingered for what felt like an eternity before it finally pulled back. It moved to the doorway, pausing for a moment as if to look back at me, and then it was gone. The weight lifted, and I was left shaking and gasping for air. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I packed a bag and left the house. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I wasn't sure they would believe me, but I couldn't stay there, not after what I had experienced. Even now, weeks later, I can still feel its presence. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, or I feel the air grow colder for no reason. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know it's not. It's still out there, watching, waiting, and I don't know if it will ever leave me alone. I never thought of myself as someone who's scared easily. Haunted houses, horror movies, ghost stories, they never really got to me. But what happened last summer changed that forever. Even now, I can't bring myself to sleep without a light on, and the shadows in the corners of my room feel heavier than they should. It started innocently enough. I had just moved into a small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I was excited to finally have my own space. The building was old, the kind of place where every step on the wooden floors echoed, and the pipes groaned like they had stories of their own to tell. I chalked up the strange noises to the building's age, convincing myself that creaks and whispers were part of the charm. The first week went by without incident. I spent my evenings unpacking, arranging furniture, and trying to make the place feel like home. But by the second week, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. It began with the lights. Sometimes they would flicker, dimming for just a moment before returning to normal. I thought it was the wiring, another quirk of the old building, and brushed it off. Then there were the sounds, soft thuds, like footsteps, coming from the apartment above me. Except the apartment above was vacant. One night, I stayed up late finishing a project for work. The clock on my laptop read 2:47 a.m. when I finally decided to call it a night. As I shut my computer and turned off the lamp, I noticed a strange stillness in the air. It was too quiet, as if the entire building was holding its breath. I crawled into bed and pulled the blanket up to my chin, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping over me. The room was dark, the faint glow of the street lamp outside casting faint lines across the walls. I closed my eyes, willing myself to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, my eyes snapped open. The clock on my bedside table read 3:12 a.m. My body felt strange, heavy, like I was sinking into the mattress. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My arms and legs were frozen, and even my head wouldn't turn. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't even scream. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the street lamp's glow, was a shadow. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a figment of my imagination born from fear. But the longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was a figure. It stood tall and still, darker than the darkness around it, as if it were absorbing the light. My eyes darted back and forth, searching for some logical explanation, but there was none. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. My heart raced as I fought against the paralysis holding me down. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but no sound escaped my lips. All I could do was lie there, trapped in my own body, as the figure seemed to grow larger, its presence filling the room. And then it moved. It didn't walk or step forward. It glided, its movements unnaturally smooth. It came closer, stopping at the foot of my bed. I could feel its weight in the air, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. The figure leaned in, its shadowy form bending unnaturally as it loomed over me. I couldn't see a face, but I felt its gaze, heavy and piercing. The air around me grew colder, and a faint whisper filled the room. "Do you see me?" The voice was low and rasping, like dry leaves scraping across the ground. The words sent a chill down my spine, and I felt tears well up in my eyes. I wanted to scream that yes, I saw it, but my body refused to obey. The figure didn't move for what felt like hours, though it was probably only seconds. Then, slowly, it began to retreat. It moved back to the corner of the room, its form blending into the shadows until it was gone. The paralysis lifted, and I sat up gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. My hands trembled as I reached for the lamp, flooding the room with light. The corner where the figure had stood was empty, but the oppressive feeling lingered. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I tried to convince myself it had been a nightmare, a trick of my tired mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The heaviness in the air, the whispers, the figure, they were too real to dismiss. For the next few nights, I avoided sleeping in the dark. I kept the lights on, every single one, and fell asleep with the TV playing softly in the background. It seemed to work at first, but the sense of being watched never went away. One night, as I lay on the couch in the living room, I felt the familiar heaviness return. My body froze, and my breath hitched as I realized I couldn't move. The TV flickered, the image distorting before the screen went black. And then it was there. The figure stood in the doorway, darker than ever. This time, it didn't hesitate. It moved toward me, its form growing larger, more defined. I could see the edges of its shadow ripple like smoke, and the whispers began again, louder and more insistent. "You can't hide," it said, its voice echoing in my mind. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears streaming down my face. I wanted it to stop, to leave me alone, but the whispers only grew louder. When I finally opened my eyes, the figure was gone, but the fear remained. I left the apartment the next day, packing a bag and checking into a hotel. I couldn't bring myself to stay there another night. Even now, weeks later, I feel its presence, like it's waiting for the right moment to return. I don't know what it was or why it came to me, but I do know this: it wasn't just a dream. It wasn't just my imagination, and no matter how far I run, I can't escape the shadows. It began the night I moved into the small, creaky house on the edge of the woods. It was an older home, one that had been vacant for a while, and the price was right for someone like me, fresh out of college and looking for something affordable. The landlord was eager to rent it, almost too eager, but I didn't think much of it. At the time, I just wanted a place to call my own. The first night felt ordinary enough. The walls groaned in protest with every breeze, and the floorboards had a way of creaking even when no one was walking on them. I figured it was just the house settling, as old houses often do. I unpacked a few boxes, set up my bed, and decided to leave the rest for the morning. By midnight, I was in bed, wrapped in the warmth of my blanket, trying to get used to the unfamiliar silence. It was different from the noise of the city I'd grown used to. This was deeper, more encompassing, like the world outside had simply ceased to exist. I told myself it was peaceful, though the pit in my stomach said otherwise. I must have fallen asleep at some point, though I don't remember when. What I do remember is the feeling of waking up, or something like it. My eyes opened to the same dark room, the faint glow of the moon spilling in through the half-closed blinds. But something was wrong. My body wouldn't move. At first, I thought it was a dream. I tried to shift my arm, my leg, even my fingers, but nothing responded. Panic bubbled up in my chest, but I couldn't cry out. My breath was shallow, my heart racing so fast I thought it might stop. I could hear it pounding in my ears, drowning out the silence of the room. And then I saw it. At the far side of the room, near the old wardrobe left behind by the previous tenant, stood a figure. It wasn't there when I went to bed, of that I was certain. It was tall, unnaturally so, and cloaked in shadow. Its outline was vague, as though the darkness itself was bending to form it. I stared at it, unable to look away, my chest tightening with each passing second. The figure didn't move, not at first. It just stood there, silent and still, as if it were waiting. My mind raced for an explanation. Maybe it was just a shadow cast by the moonlight, a trick of my imagination. But then it shifted. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. It leaned slightly forward, and though it had no face that I could see, I felt its gaze. It was a feeling I couldn't describe, as though something ancient and malevolent was peering into my very soul. The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavy with an oppressive weight. I could feel my body trembling, though I still couldn't move. My breath hitched as the figure began to glide toward me, its movements unnaturally smooth. I tried to scream, to force some sound from my throat, but my body betrayed me. The figure stopped at the foot of the bed, looming over me. The shadows around it seemed to ripple and shift, swallowing what little light there was in the room. And then it spoke. The voice was a whisper, low and guttural, like the wind moving through the cracks of an old door. I couldn't make out the words at first, but the sound was enough to send a chill down my spine. Slowly, the whispers grew louder, the words forming into something I could understand. "Why do you wake?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to answer, to scream that I didn't know, but my body wouldn't let me. The figure leaned closer, the darkness surrounding it pressing against me like a physical force. "You shouldn't be here," it said, the words dragging like claws against my mind. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure began to recede. It moved backward, its form dissolving into the shadows until the room was empty once more. The weight lifted, and I gasped for air, my body trembling violently as I sat up in bed. The rest of the night was a blur. I sat in the corner of the room, every light in the house turned on, waiting for the sun to rise. When morning finally came, I convinced myself it had been sleep paralysis, a nightmare brought on by the stress of moving. It was the only explanation that made sense. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The following nights were worse. The figure came back, always at the same time, always in the same corner. It never touched me, never harmed me, but its presence was enough to make my skin crawl. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear. Some nights, I could feel it even before I opened my eyes, the air in the room thick with its presence. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom after the first week, opting instead for the couch in the living room. But even there, the figure found me. It wasn't just the nights either. During the day, I started noticing things I couldn't explain. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, objects shifted slightly from where I left them, and the air always felt heavy, like the house was holding its breath. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, I heard a soft knock at the front door. It was faint, almost hesitant, but enough to make my heart leap into my throat. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. No one was there. I opened the door slowly, stepping out onto the porch. The woods beyond the house were dark, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I was about to go back inside when I noticed something on the ground. It was a small piece of paper, folded neatly in half. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. Scrawled in messy, jagged handwriting were 3 words. "I see you." I dropped the paper and slammed the door, locking it and bolting it for good measure. My heart raced as I pressed my back against the door, staring out at the empty room. That night, the figure didn't just stand in the corner. It moved closer, its whispers filling the room with an intensity that made my ears ache. "You can't run," it said, the words echoing in my mind. I don't know how I made it through that night, but when morning came, I packed a bag and left. I didn't bother explaining to the landlord. I didn't care about the deposit. I just needed to get out. Even now, in a new apartment miles away, I can't shake the feeling that it followed me. Every shadow feels too dark, every silence too loud. And at night, when the lights are off, I swear I can hear the whispers. I never used to be afraid of the dark. As a kid, I'd laugh at the idea of monsters hiding under the bed or lurking in the closet. To me, darkness was just the absence of light, nothing more. But now, years later, I find myself dreading every sunset, every flicker of a light bulb, every shadow that stretches across the floor when the day fades away. It all began during a particularly stressful month. I was working long hours at the office and barely getting enough sleep. The exhaustion was beginning to weigh on me, but I didn't have time to rest. I was staying in my parents' old house while I tried to save up for a place of my own. The house was large, built decades ago, with creaky floorboards and a furnace that groaned like an old man in the middle of the night. One evening, after a grueling day at work, I collapsed into bed. My body ached, and my eyes burned from staring at a screen for hours. I closed my eyes and prayed for sleep to come quickly. At first, it seemed like it had. I drifted into a haze, my mind finally letting go of the day's worries. But then, something jolted me awake. My eyes opened to the dark room, and immediately I knew something was wrong. I couldn't move. My arms, my legs, even my fingers were frozen in place. Panic surged through me as I realized I couldn't even turn my head. My body felt pinned to the mattress, as if invisible hands were pressing me down. I tried to cry out, but no sound came. My lips wouldn't move, and my voice was trapped in my throat. That's when I noticed the shadows. At first, they were just shapes in the corners of the room, darker than the already pitch-black surroundings. I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, creating forms where there were none. But as I stared, unable to look away, the shadows began to move. One by one, they detached from the corners, their shapes becoming more defined. They weren't just patches of darkness. They were figures, tall and thin, their edges shifting and rippling like smoke. There were 3 of them, and they stood still for a moment, as if watching me. My heart raced as I struggled against the invisible force holding me down. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get up, to run, but I was helpless. The figures began to move, gliding silently toward my bed. Their movements were unnatural, as if they weren't bound by the same rules as the rest of us. The first figure stopped at the foot of the bed, its head tilting slightly to one side, like a curious animal. It didn't have a face, just a void where its features should have been, but I felt its gaze. It was a feeling I can't describe, like a cold hand reaching into my chest and squeezing my heart. The other 2 figures flanked the sides of the bed, their forms bending and stretching as they loomed over me. I wanted to scream, to beg them to leave, but the paralysis kept me silent. My breathing became shallow, each inhale a struggle as the air in the room grew thick and oppressive. The figure at the foot of the bed leaned closer. I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating, as it whispered something I couldn't understand. The words were faint, like a breeze carrying a secret, but they echoed in my mind, growing louder and more distorted until they became a cacophony of sound. Tears streamed down my face as I fought against the paralysis. My body burned with the effort to move, to escape, but the shadows didn't budge. They stayed there, watching, whispering, as if feeding off my fear. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The figures receded, their shapes dissolving into the darkness until they were gone. The weight lifted from my chest, and I gasped for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. I turned on every light in the room, clutching the blanket like it could protect me from whatever I had just witnessed. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but the feeling of their presence, the weight of their gaze, was too vivid to dismiss. I told myself I just needed rest, that it wouldn't happen again, but it did. The following night, I was too afraid to sleep in the dark. I left the bedside lamp on, its warm glow spilling across the room. It made me feel safer, though only slightly. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I tried to push the memories of the previous night out of my mind. It didn't work. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to the same suffocating paralysis. My body was frozen, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. The lamp was still on, its light casting long shadows across the room. But something was wrong. The shadows were moving. They stretched and twisted, forming shapes that didn't belong. The figures were back, their forms even darker and more defined than before. This time, there were more of them. They filled the room, their presence overwhelming. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They came from every corner, every shadow, filling my ears until I thought my head would explode. The figures moved closer, surrounding the bed. One of them leaned in, its face, or lack of one, mere inches from mine. I could feel its cold breath against my skin, its whispers drilling into my mind. "You don't belong here," it said, its voice a guttural rasp. Terror consumed me as I fought against the paralysis. I don't know how, but I managed to move my hand, my fingers clawing for the lamp switch. The moment the room was flooded with light, the figures vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence. I spent the next day in a daze, unable to focus on anything. I told myself I had to leave, that staying in the house was a mistake. But part of me didn't want to believe it was real. The third night was the worst. I tried staying awake, drinking coffee, and keeping the TV on for background noise. But exhaustion won, and I eventually drifted off. This time, I didn't wake up in my bed. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the middle of the living room, the shadows swirling around me. The figures were everywhere, their whispers deafening. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, as they closed in. The last thing I remember before blacking out was their touch, cold and sharp, like needles pressing into my skin. When I woke up, it was morning. I was back in bed, the covers pulled tightly around me, but I knew it hadn't been a dream. The bruises on my arms and the faint marks on my neck were proof. I left the house that day, packing only what I could carry. I didn't tell my parents why, didn't try to explain. I just needed to get out. Even now, weeks later, I can feel their presence. Every shadow feels alive, every whisper a reminder that they're still watching. And no matter where I go, I can't escape them.